And then it should give everyone a message. Cool. And then does your review have a break in the middle or
We do. So I created a little card that's just the agenda that I was gonna put up between now and when we start at 9 a.m. And then I was gonna put like return at,
okay.
10
Y-
minutes on the
Yeah,
same
yeah.
card, if that's okay, or do I need to pause the live stream?
No, that's totally fine. You will have to, since I'm giving host capabilities
And
back
then
to
it should
you,
give
you
everyone
a message. Cool. Sorry. You would have to stay on the
social.
live stream and just so it doesn't break the YouTube link. I don't think I'm covering the studio in the afternoon. I think somebody else is. But somebody else from communications will be here after the break.
Okay,
Yeah.
great.
So I'll be here for the first part and then I believe somebody else will be here after.
All right, thank you. And
All
I
right.
do have like the directions for how to end the live stream at the end. Should be okay. I don't know.
Okay.
I don't know if y'all just like are here in case to oversee or to do that. But if you need me to end it or anything, I
I
can.
think I think once you oh actually you know what you do? I'm gonna give the host back to you. Um but what you're gonna do is there where all the like buttons are at the bottom, there's gonna be a more option.
Mhm.
That's like three dots. And when you click on that, there's an option to end live stream. And that's what you'll click on when you want to end it.
Great.
Yep.
All right.
All right. Well, I will just be here taking screenshots for social media until the first break. So,
Oh, thanks so much. Well, I'll put
yeah.
the little agenda card up for now.
Oh,
And
awesome.
if you need anything, obviously you can see it really easily. I have my desktop computer set up to do DMs because since I control the slideshow for the students during their presentations, they don't have to
Hmm.
click through. It's hard for me on my laptop to see any, messages that I might need to address during the
Yeah.
thing. So just in case you need me for anything like that, you can email me or you can use that one for a chat
All right.
DM.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Hi, Robbie. Thanks for joining us.
Glad I can do it. I was worried I didn't kept asking John for the link, and in fact, I even just called Ann Masson to see whether she received a link. So I'm glad I got it. Thank you for sending it.
Oh, of course, absolutely. Sorry about that. And obviously, we're just waiting for everyone to get started. So, feel free to hang out until then. We are on the live stream for YouTube, so I just have up the agenda as a placeholder until everyone joins in.
Great, thank you.
Thanks so much. Good morning, John.
Hi, Tony. How are you?
Good. We have Robbie waiting until we get everyone arrives and we get started. And we've already have the live stream on the YouTube channel that the school has set up for the review going. So I'll just put up the agenda card in advance of everyone starting while it was live streamed.
Okay. So we start at 9 o'clock sharp, right?
Correct. Mhm.
All right.
Great. Just a couple more minutes.
Yeah. Wow. It all came together very handsomely.
Yes.
Hey, Tony,
Yes.
can you hear a humming in the background of like the air conditioning system?
No, I don't think so.
Okay, good. Thank you. Just checking.
Oh, sure.
I'm in Q2 and it's loud as always.
No, it sounds like they're doing a good job of filtering that.
Hey, John, what's it like sitting in the middle of Jackson Square? It looks like you're in the middle of the square.
Yeah, I'm having my fortune read here down in front of St. Louis Cathedral. It's just great.
Ah, good. Hope you get a good fortune.
She makes more money than all of us put together. Thank you, Robbie, for being with us.
Glad to do it. I was in Mobile yesterday going to look at the cathedral there, and they need a lot of help there. A lot of termite damage, a lot of masonry work, a lot of stone work on the church. I don't ever remember going into that church before, but it is so big. They claim it's older than St. Louis Cathedral, but I find it hard to believe that that much money was generated in a city of Mobile size to build such a huge cathedral there. It dwarfs St. Louis Cathedral.
I'll be darned. That is very interesting. I was driving through Mobile yesterday. I could have stopped and helped out. As you may know, part of my life is going to be in Southern Alabama going forward, and I look forward to learning more about practice in that area. And Mobile, of course, is the center of the world, but it's I'll look into it. If I can help you out that way, let me know.
Thank you.
I don't know if you can hear me, Tony. Okay, I was just saying hello really quickly, John, Tony, Robbie, before I put this on mute and proctor exam for my my students. In the background, you'll see how much time they have left on the board.
We'll make sure everyone notes that that is not for their personal presentation in the course of this one. Thanks, Tomas.
Thank you, Thomas.
Good morning.
Hi, Eric. How's it going?
just have a minute or two before we begin, and I'm just letting everyone know that we are currently on the YouTube live stream that the school has set up for guests to attend. So that's going, and just to be sure, I will also record once we start the morning's presentations. Thank you.
Okay, Tony?
Yep, I'll start right now. I notice we have all of our respondents for the morning in attendance. I'm ready when you are. Shall I start recording?
Hello, everyone. My name is John Stubbs. Hello, everyone. My name is John Stubbs, a co-instructor for Studio 2 Urban Conservation, taught within the Master of Preservation Studies program at Tulane University. We're going to present today a whole semester's work in this course that entail 3 projects. We'll be talking about the highlights of these 3 projects as presented by the 19 students and the class. Co-instructor for the course, Tony DiMaggio, and I set this up to be a deep investigation into the art of urban conservation planning. The projects evolved in ascending order of complexity from a project in our famous historic district, the Vieux Carré in New Orleans, to a representative small southern town in a nearby plantation in Thibodaux, Louisiana, to finally addressing an urgent issue faced in the region and indeed throughout the world, a problem dealing with sea level change and flood mitigation. We're very pleased today to have all the students presenting their fine work. It's been an excellent semester all around. Spirits were very high and a huge amount of work was accomplished in our aims to learn about this important aspect of cultural heritage protection. In today's presentation, we'll be benefited by respondents who will speak to these presentations after each project is presented. First is Ann Finney, who is with the U.S. National Park Service. She's a cultural resource technical advisor with the Park Service Southeast Regional Storm Recovery Team. Her particular specialty is in advising on storm recovery issues throughout the country, but especially in the southern region and the Caribbean, and advises the Park Service on all kinds of matters pertaining to documentation of cultural heritage of all kinds, archaeology, cultural landscapes, ethnographic resources, and the like. We're very pleased to have Ann join us as a respondent for this morning's session. Our second respondent, who will be with us only part of the morning, but we certainly value his participation, is the architect Robert Cangelosi, who is an instructor to these students as well in his course, New Orleans Architecture. Robbie is brilliantly trained in the field and is without doubt the primary restoration architect in the region. We'll also be joined by Kelly Calhoun, a graduate of the Tulane MPS program. Kelly is a very active consultant in the field today with many interests and capacities. Kelly, we thank you for returning to the program to help us as a professional in the field, looking back on training you had yourself not too long ago. Excuse me. Our final respondent to present to you today is Mia Kaplan, who recently graduated from the program at Tulane, and she is well on her way in her career as an architect and a preservationist with a double degree in the field, who's had experience with the kind of projects we'll be presenting today. Mia has been a resource to this class thus far this semester. We're very pleased to have Mia join us. Others may drop in as they can, including Director of the program, Brent Fortenberry, and the Dean of the School of Architecture is observing this project very keenly because of his interest in some of the topics we've addressed as well. They will be viewing it possibly asynchronously. So without further ado, and unless I've left anything out, Tony, I will let the students present. There are 3 presentations. You all have an agenda. We've hopefully carefully timed them so that they end up being a balanced presentation of our 3 projects. The first would be Project 1, the Landmark and Tude Ensemble, History, Documentation, and Preservation Considerations for Iconic Buildings in the Vieux-Carré. So I will turn it over to the students to present their various projects within the larger project of looking at iconic buildings in the French Quarter, their past, present, and future prospects in the post-COVID era. Thank you. Over to the students, please. Oops. I think the first presenter may be holding back or on mute at the moment, but while we have the screen up, it does show the location of the projects in the quarter and who's been working on what. This is a classic example of a team approach of students picking projects that interested them for independence, their own analysis and work that formed parts of a total investigation. So the presentation of the French Quarter project will begin now, please.
Hi, everyone. Good morning. My name is JL, and I will be starting the presentation for the French Quarter. Looking at the image over here is an overhaul of all of the projects done in the French Quarter for the first part of the semester. Next page. So I will be discussing the Creole Cottage. Next. So the Creole Cottage is a house typology that is known in New Orleans for many reasons. In the French Quarter and in the city, it was popular between the 1790s and the 1870s. It's normally 1 to 1.5 stories tall, and then it has a hipped or side gable roof, narrow gabled dormer windows, and an overhang or above to protect the front of the house from the weather. It is symmetrical in the facade with 4 openings, with 4 sets of French doors with shutters, or 2 sets of French doors and 2 sets of double hung windows with shutters. Earlier structures typically are break between post or masonry construction. Later structures typically frame construction with wood and weatherboard siding. On the right is a typical 4-bay Creole Cottage house floor plan. It is 2 rooms wide, 2 rooms deep, with a cabinet in the back for storage. And occasionally they are 2-bay wide or 6 bay wide. with the 2-bay being 1 room wide and the 6-bay being 3 rooms wide. Next. So this is a map of the French Quarter and all of the Creole cottages within the quarter. Looking at this image, it is apparent why the Creole cottages are an important part of the tout ensemble of the French Quarter, as it makes up a huge amount of it. Next. This map shows the color rating of the Creole cottages within the French Quarter. Looking at the map, you can see that most of the cottages are green, which is of local architectural historical importance. And there are a few scattered around that are major architectural or historical importance. And also a few that are of national architecture and historical importance. Next. So I also took a look at the uses of the Creole cottages within the French Quarter. The blue are the commercial houses or the commercial Creole cottages being used, and then the orange are being used for residential. As you can see, most of the residential and the are to the right of the French Quarter, with the commercial mainly being along Bourbon Street and some gathered on Rampart Street. Next. So some of the preservation issues that I found with the Creole cottages in the French Quarter are that they're not being properly maintained, and there are some repairs that are being done that are I consider to be insensitive, and also there are some insensitive rehabilitations. Shown in this image is 741 Ursuline Street, which is the Quartermaster Deli. As you can see, there's the dormers on the front of the building are not proportionate to the house, which I believe were insensitive repairs or added later, which I think are very detrimental to the Creole cottages in the French Quarter. Next. Looking at this image over here, which is the Razoo Bar and Patio on Bourbon Street, I believe that this building suffers from poor and improper maintenance and insensitive rehabilitations. Looking at the historic image to the right, you can see how this building used to be several businesses at once, but now it's just one building, meaning that the interior of the building was gutted to allow easy flow through the building, causing detrimental damage to the structure on the inside, and also improper maintenance. Next. So some of the potential solutions that I found for the Creole cottages that are being used for commercial purposes in the French Quarter are basically better and more frequent maintenance to the buildings to ensure that they last, change of use to the buildings, and also more sensitive rehabilitation, such as shown in this image over here on 809 Royal Street. The interior of the building, rather than gutting the whole thing, it is properly divided to kind of show some continuation of what used to be there before. And I believe that this is what needs to happen to some of the Creole cottages within the French Quarter to ensure that they continue to last. Thank you.
Hi, so my name is Tiffany Bell. My project is Madame John's Legacy at 632 Domain Street. My project is mapping change over time at Madame John's Legacy. Next. Here is Madame John's Legacy within the Beau Carré. It is 1 block away from Jackson Square and St. Louis Cathedral. Next. Madame John's Legacy is an extremely significant property. It's rated nationally significant by the Beau Carré Commission, which is the top level of significance given by the BCC. Only a small number of blocks in the Beau Carré contain 1 or more nationally significant buildings. Next. Here you can see Madame John's Legacy relationship to other nationally significant sites such as Jackson Square, St. Louis Cathedral, and the Pentalba buildings over time. Next. There are 3 structures on the site, and all 3 are considered nationally significant. There's a main house and 2 dependency buildings behind it. Next. So behind the main house is a kitchen building, and behind that is a stable building. Next. The main house at Madame John's Legacy has a raised brick basement, framed 2nd story with a deep front porch, and a massive hip roof with 2 small dormers. The main house was built immediately after the fire of 1788 in the footprint and style of a house on the site since the 1720s. It's one of the few remaining structures in the French Quarter from the city's colonial period. Next. So the house was a residential house until the late 19th century when the property was eventually divided into apartments. Next. In 1947, the property was donated to the Louisiana State Museum. Louisiana State Museum operated the main house as a house museum with periodic closings for restoration and repairs. Next. So Madame John's legacy has had several rounds of conservation work since the 1940s. The dependency buildings were never restored during any of these restoration campaigns, and they remain unrestored to this day. During all of the restoration campaigns, though, in the main house, a major issue was the deterioration of the masonry walls and floor at the ground level. Next. The ground masonry has deteriorated due to complications associated with rising damp. All of the past restoration campaigns utilized Portland cement-based materials that were not appropriate to repair the masonry and in fact caused further deterioration. Several state-of-the-art conservation studies were completed on the property and all focused on addressing the conservation of the ground floor masonry. Next. As a result, studies, including this one, these images from a study by Tulane, recommended removing all Portland cement-based repair materials and replacing them with appropriate materials. Further, to work closely with a specialty materials conservation consultant to stop the issues associated with rising damp and any future issues. These recommendations are currently not being implemented to any degree, and so the current status of the building is that it is in dire need of stabilization and conservation with appropriate materials. Next. So the future. Next, Louisiana State Museum has several museums within the Vieux Carré to tell the history of New Orleans and Louisiana, so keeping Madame John's legacy as a house museum of the late 18th century would be an appropriate use. Next, but I believe the vacant dependency buildings present a unique opportunity to focus on the lives of the many enslaved people and servants who historically lived in the Vieux Carré. So my proposal for the use of the building is twofold. The moisture problems of the main house need to be properly addressed and soon, and the expanded interpretation of the site by utilizing the dependency buildings to make space for narratives of those who occupied dependency buildings historically in the Vieux Carré. So thank you.
Hi, my name is Vivian LePere, and I'm going to be presenting on the New Orleans Pharmacy Museum next. So this slide is just to highlight the beauty of all the different curiosities and the interesting things that you can find in this museum the minute you step through the door. It's just a very interesting building and just something that would be great to preserve going forward. Next. So here, just a quick look of where it is in relation to Jackson Square and where it is in the French Quarter. It's about a block away from Jackson Square. It's that little blue box highlighted in the corner there. Next. So here, just looking back, these are just some of the Sanborn maps showing how it's changed and the layout of the actual building with the back house being removed at some point along the line after it went into a period of deterioration and no one really taking care of it. Next. This is just an elevation of the building when it went through that period of deterioration when people weren't really taking care of the building. Next. Again, this just highlights a beautiful drawing of the facade and what it could have looked like, potentially looked like by Boyd Cruz, and then an image of it currently in 2022. Next. So here's just a quick timeline kind of the history of the building. It was, the reason this building is so important is it was home to the very first pharmaceutical, the first pharmacist, Louis DeFilo and his whole family. And then it was turned over to another family who also worked in pharmaceuticals, the Dupas family. They lived in the second floor. And then over time, it was put into the hands of the city after it went through just multiple changing of hands and it went through a mode of deterioration. And then back in 1950, it was officially turned into a museum, one of the biggest and most recognizable pharmaceutical museums in the nation. And then back in 1986, they actually restored it once again to open up the secondary floors. People to exhibit more of the very interesting artifacts that they have there. And currently it is still being used as a museum and an event space next. So here is the plan from 1837, highlighting how it used to be home to a carriage house in the back and slave quarters, which have gone to, which have been destroyed now and are currently just turned into a large courtyard in the back. Next. Just some more photos highlighting the upstairs area next. This is kind of what it's used for now, just some events, and it could be used for even more events next. So just highlighting just the current state of the facade as well. One of the things that I think would be a great recommendation is re-looking at all of those little holes and crevices, restoring the paint, and revitalizing a lot of the metalwork in the balconies next. Again, here you can see some wear on the rises and some water damage next. And here's just a highlight of different types of tours that would be really interesting for them to incorporate. As of now, they only have one standard tour of the building, but I think to be able to make it a place where people could come back and reuse it and re-see it in different lights, it could be very interesting to do a cocktail tour, classic pharmacy tour, maybe a living in the French Quarter tour. Just add some more programming and make it a place where people want to come back and revisit next. Another idea would be looking at another museum who does similar stuff, the Mutter Museum. They have programming, a lot of educational programming, which would be really interesting to implement into this project as well next. So this is just highlighting overall recommendations, repairing the damage to the building facade, stabilizing the third floor, revamping their online presence, implementing new styles of guided tours, and adding educational experiences to the event lineups next. And that's just why we're excited.
Good morning. My name is Monica Davis, and I did my French Quarter project on the Bourget Kai's House Museum. It's a historic house museum built in 1826, and it's a transition between the French and American building traditions. Next, please. It is a perforated building and on the French Quarter. Here, as you can see in the blue, where it's marked that located in the French Quarter. Next, please. Here's also a Sanborn map of 1896. The main house, which is the BK house, and the slave quarters addition of the house was built in 1826. It's a perforated building. And then we have the yellow rating of the garden and another portion of the slave dwellings. Next, please. It is currently 4 different structures built on this site. The slave quarters and the BK house was built in 1826, and then some additions in the 1950s. Next, please. It was the first building to be documented. So this is some documentation of that building. Next, please. It went into disrepair in the early 1950s. So you can see some of the disrepair that has happened in that back courtyard area. That domestic dwellings was kind of falling into disrepair. And so Kai's, who bought the house during that time period, got with local architects to rehab the house and the slave dwellings in the back. Next, please. This is an extensive timeline over the centuries. The house has been occupied by different people, but not all of those people have been recognized. And so in my proposal, it's bringing more light to the other occupants of the BK house. Next, please. Again, the timelines goes on. You can see in the 1970s, that's when Kai's purchased it and began her renovation. Next, please. So my presentation proposal is understanding the life of the enslaved families who lived in the domestic dwellings in the back. They lived there between 1826 and 1865, and they were prominent in keeping the house together and doing their daily domestic chores. Next, please. This is a view of the floor plan of the domestic dwellings. On the first floor would have been where they did most of their cooking and cleaning and doing the occupations that distributed to the main house, and then they lived on the upper portion. Next, please. This is a 1930s view of the disrepair of that home. Next, please. And this is kind of the what it looks like now with some type of renovations that has been added. Next, please. So currently in that dwelling in the back is the Kai's exhibition. So my proposal will use virtual reality techniques and headsets to understand the broader history of the African American enslavement within the urban dwelling of the French Quarter. Next, please. These are some names that I was able to find within looking at succession records. So it has for each owner how many slaves they own, some of their names and their ages. So I think this is paramount into understanding the enslaved dwellings and understanding the people who lived there prior to. Next, please. This is also another family who owned several slaves in that time period and their names and listings. Next, please. And then this is great because I also enlisted their age, their occupations, and where they came from, and where sometimes after they was freed from enslavement, what they did after. So this would be a great interpretation to also show through that VR technology. Next, please. And again, some more enslaved names and documentation of the enslaved. Next, please. Okay, so at the Herman Grumman House, they have an urban enslavement exhibition that kind of you would understand the way of life of the enslaved. So this is some images that I took while visiting the exhibition. Next, please. Different things for the dependencies that help the house keep going. We have the kitchen, the dishwasher area, and then the clothing area. Next, please. So what is my proposal? Telling the enslaved story. So utilizing VR technology for immersion learning experience. This can also be a great way for the Historic House Museum to broaden their people coming in, to have more information for African-American students, and also to have that more minority presence within the French Quarter for people to come and learn more about the enslaved population of the French Quarter. Next, please. Different people have used, different sites have also used this. And this is also, I found this information in 1861, how waiting to be, I guess, brought and sold. So this is some pictures that can be used during that virtual reality session. Next, please. And these are two photos that I found for a woman of color and a house slave in the 1840s. So it would be great to see these people on the walls at the BK House and not just what you normally see now when you walk in there. Thank you. Next, please.
Good morning, my name is Tess Temple, and I worked with Taylor Cummings to look into the history of Latrobes on Royal. Next. Latrobes is located within the French Quarter and is marked by the red dot on this map. Next.
These are some current photos of the exterior of Latrobes. Next slide, please.
The building was designed by Benjamin Henry Latrobe to be the Louisiana State Bank and was completed in 1822, a year after his death. After its
Taylor, I think Tess froze up. I don't know if you want to try.
Okay, we can just keep going. So yeah, this is just a little timeline. So of what was Louisiana Bank, but now is Latrobe. So you can see it was declared a National Historic Landmark in 1983 and became an event space in the early 2000s. And then yeah, I think Tess' computer died, so I'll just keep going. So this is a building usage map, and there'll be two more from this, and it just shows the progression of the building usage in the neighborhood. So yeah, and then this is from 1908, and next slide, 1951, next slide. These are just elevations showing around the block. At the time, it was the Mannheim Gallery, so it's gone through many different uses. I think it was on Tess's slide, it was the Louisiana State Bank originally, then it was some Turkish baths, and then it was the Mannheim Gallery, and now it's Latrobe's. Next slide, please. So these are front and side elevations. Next slide, please. These are just showing the different heights that some of those key points are at. Next slide, please. So just highlighting some details. So there's archways above the windows and doors. Next slide, please. So a pitched roof. Next slide. And then some dormers. Next slide. And there is a back addition. It's right there in red. And most notably, this is the courtyard, and it was roofed over in 1930, so it's now indoor space. And you can see that in the present photo. Next slide. So the most notable feature of the Louisiana State Bank, now Latrobe's, is its whisper dome. So you can see in the upper diagram that is supported on 4 piers, which each gate 4 separate corner chambers. So above the dome is a crawl space, and it sits above a green concrete floor, which was from its Turkish bath era. I believe they redid the floors during there. So you can see all that in diagram and pictures. Next slide, please. So this was just that crawl space in the top of the dome. Next slide. This is a section view, so just really showing that really interesting section of the building and the different domes and spaces within. Next slide. So these are just some key features throughout the building. A lot of historic features still there. Next slide. And this was the original bank vault, which now has 2 newer doorways. So you can see a lot of the old bank documents are still there, and then that original bank vault door is still there and in use. Next slide. So the original exterior finishing was lawn faux sandstone with faux scoring. So you could see there's still some remnants of that in the now interior courtyard. And next slide. So the building has a few issues. So climate, subsidence, and tourism and just heavy traffic have added to kind of the depletion and kind of it's been a little bit run down, but overall it's been maintained well by the current owner. Next slide, please. So this is just a little render showing what it would look like if it still had that original lighter finish with the scoring. It's now kind of bright yellow paint. So maybe restoring it to its original finish would be the right way to go. And I believe that's it. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Ryan Green, and I'll be presenting Robert Fisher and I's proposal, Antoine's 2040. Next slide, please. Antoine's is located at the corner of St. Louis Street and Royal Street in the French Quarter. You can see its location on the block map at the left, and it's really a complex of about 7 different buildings, as seen in the diagram on the right, that were acquired over a series of decades from the 1860s until about 1918. So it's a really fascinating complex within the French Quarter. Next slide, please. As part of the project, we undertook a timeline and learned a lot about the history of the restaurant. Some of the highlights are that it was first opened in 1840. In the 1860s, they moved to their current location, and it was renovated to have its present look, with the mansard roof as being the distinct main portion of the complex in 1874. In its original form, it operated both as a restaurant and a hotel, or kind of a quick motel style hotel. And we can go on to the next slide. Through the early 1900s and into the mid 1900s, it became very popular, both for visiting dignitaries to New Orleans and during the Mardi Gras season. It has a series of rooms that are dedicated to the different Mardi Gras crews throughout the city, and they come and use the space as a dining location, a meeting location during the season. Next slide, please. Throughout the past 2 decades or so, the restaurant has gone through a series of renovations. This diagram on the right shows what the complex looks like today. It's multiple buildings that make it up, from styles ranging from French Second Empire to kind of traditional Creole colonial buildings. So they have focused the past 2 decades on creating accessibility throughout this series of buildings, doing some structural stabilization work, and then reprogramming some of the spaces to meet current needs. Next slide. These series of diagrams showing the floor plans of the building, levels 1, 2, 3, and 4, show the work that has happened over the past few years. So this includes reprogramming, putting in an elevator into the building, which spans all 4 floors of the main complex, streamlining kitchen spaces and renovating HVAC, adding safety guardrails on the upper levels of the balconies, and sprinklering the building in its entirety. Next slide. there was some structural stabilization that occurred after Hurricane Katrina when a beam in the main dining room failed, as well as an upper wall of the building that had partially collapsed and needed to be reconstructed. Next slide. And then some of the reprogramming that's happened is changing the Hermes dining room into an operational bar, so people are able to just come into the bar space instead of needing to use the entire restaurant. And then the reopening of the Japanese dining room on the building's second floor, which is about to go through renovation again. Next slide. Some of the issues that the complex and Antoine's as an organization are facing now include the loss of staff after COVID-19, which was a major kind of detriment to the restaurant. About 40% of the entire complex goes unused currently. And then a lot of those unused spaces, as seen in these images, are in major disrepair currently. Next slide. So this series of diagrams shows the program of the building from the dining rooms to the surface spaces. And the real important part to highlight in all of this is the pink, which is the unused spaces of the building. So it's the entire third and fourth floors, as well as some spots on the first level and second level. Next slide. Some of the solutions or proposals we wanted to make to Antoine's to consider like how they can operate a little bit better in the future would be to do something along the lines of like a takeout style to go on the first floor where they have a current empty tenant space. We think this is a good location because it's closely in close proximity to the kitchens. And this makes something a lot more casual than the standard dining experience and would bring in instant revenue and doesn't require a high staffing volume. Next slide. And longer term, we would like to see the renovation of some of the upper floors of the building to their historic uses as boarding rooms, as like some kind of hotel or rental space for guests to use, who would be able to use both the dining rooms and then stay in the upper levels of the building to make sure that they're being utilized. Next slide. So this shows the elevation right now of the main block of the building. Next slide. The dining rooms on the main levels, the spaces that are currently used. Next slide. The current state of those upper levels being completely unutilized and deteriorating away. Next slide. And what the upper floors of the building could look like possibly in the future. Next slide. Thank you very much.
Okay. Good morning. My name is Noah Epstein. I'm presenting on the McDonough.
Hey, Noah, you're breaking up. You're fuzzy.
Right, is this better?
Yes.
Very
for
much.
sure.
All right, I'm sorry, guys. Good morning. My name is Noah Epstein. I'm presenting on the McDonough 15 School located at 721 St. Philip Street. It is currently occupied by Homer Plessy Community School. I'd like to thank James Rolfe, Aaron Holmes, Tony DiMaggio, and John Stubbs for their assistance this semester. Next slide, please. This color-coded VCC map shows the current footprint of the school. It is currently classified as yellow, meaning it contributes to the character of the district, but has a low level of significance as it was constructed in the 20th century in 1932 by esteemed architect E.A. Christie. Next slide, please. This satellite image shows that unlike most buildings in the district, it stretches nearly from Bourbon Street to Royal Street, filling nearly half a full city block. Next slide, please. While the school was built in 1932, it replaced the St. Philip School for Boys, shown here, which was built in 1860. The school has operated on this site for nearly 160 years. Next slide, please. This 1896 Sanborn map overlays the expansion of the school on the block and shows how the orientation changed, while the elevation drawing on the right shows the school in contrast with the rest of the block. Next slide, please. The school is connected to Tulane by its principal in the 1970s and 80s, Lucienne Carmichael, who championed arts education and started Studio in the Woods before she donated it to Tulane. The school was partially refurbished in 2007 following Hurricane Katrina. 2 different charters have operated in the school since. First, KIPP McDonough 15, and now Homer Plessy Community School. Next slide, please. The school serves a diverse demographic population. Unlike nearly every other building in the French Quarter, it solely serves the local population. This year, the Homer Plessy Community School tried to vacate and move to a Rise Academy in the Bywater. However, they lost out that bid to another charter, and they will remain in the school for at least another year. The school board gave them a few $1,000,000 to try to make it more ADA compliant, but this speaks to the existential danger that the school is under, because the school board is incentivized to sell it and recoup all the money instead of trying to refurbish it. Next slide, please. I was struck with the unusual turn spindle security gate entrance to the school. The school has a high level of integrity because of all the original fenestration, the windows and doors, all of which are in dire need of repair. Next slide, please. In summation, it is of paramount importance to keep this school in service. Very few buildings in the French Quarter serve residents, as the tourist trade is so much more remunerative. Deteriorated wood should be tested for lead, and all exterior woodwork should be refurbished as soon as possible, possibly using historic tax credits to mitigate the expense, as the school board is doing on the West Bank at Behrman Elementary. Preserving the last remaining school in the quarter should be of paramount importance to the residents of the quarter, the city, and the school board. Thank you for your time. The last thing the French Quarter needs is more pied-à-terre condos. This is my bibliography. Thanks, guys.
Hi, everyone. My name is Sarah Tankersley. I did the property at 941 Bourbon Street. Next slide. It is a blue rating building, which has historic importance. Next slide. It is also known as John Lafitte's Blacksmith Shop, and it is a brick between post French colonial style structure. As doing part of the historic research, I wanted to find out a little bit more about the accuracy of its histories. The Sanborns do say that it was a shop, but never actually listed as a blacksmith shop. It is questionable who built the property, and some dates and names are vague. Next slide. Originally, it was a land grant back in 1722. Next slide. In 1885, the Sanborns show that it was a shop. Next slide. In the 1896 and the 1908, it changes from a shop or dwelling to nogged dwelling. Some interesting things in the chain of title. We're trying to determine exactly when it was built and who built it. Back in 1761, we do know that the land was acquired by Pierre Reville, by Jean-Baptiste Laporte and Dominic Jolly, and it probably was about that time. Next slide. This is an example of the record exchange that took place in the chain of title, along with some interesting streetscape that was drawn in 1963. Next slide. Here's some original pictures. This is probably when the stucco was most complete back in 1880. You can see that it has its chimney. Next slide. Here it is in 1890. Next slide. Here it is again in 1933. As you will notice, its chimney is gone and the stucco is starting to deteriorate. Next slide. The halves were done by Sam Wilson. Next slide. Some interesting things were that, actually, next slide, please. Some interesting things is that he said in 1934 that at this point, the chimneys had been removed and that the fireboxes had actually been bricked over. Next slide. Here you have it again in 1937. This was after the halves were done, still no chimney, and the deterioration of the stucco has not been done. Next slide. Again in 1939. Next slide. And so some preservation suggestions that I have currently. By the way, this picture was done in the 80s. You can kind of see, but the chimney is back, and it's interesting to try to find sort of when that happened because it's not in the historic record. But since it is the continuously running bar in the States, I would say just keep it. Obviously, they're making a lot of income that they could do like the proper restorations to this. So the level of maintenance definitely needs to be addressed, especially the mesh that is coming through the stucco. Next slide. And so some of the needs that I pointed out is that the cypress posts do need to be protected per VCC product specifications. Definitely rebuild the crack portion of the courtyard masonry so that it can exact the existing. Removing the cement repairs that are all throughout the building, especially the interior, and apply stucco. And so try to prevent name carving on the posts and drawings on the brick walls. And then I would say to do that, schedule regular structural integrity inspections by a third party that's okayed by the VCC. And then definitely repairing the exposed lat that's embedded in the stucco. Thank you very much. That's all.
Thank you very much for those excellent presentations. It's now time for any responses from our respondents group to any or all of these presentations. Thank you once again for being on time with such clear presentations. And I might add, were about 6 or maybe 7 of about 14 different projects in the quarter. We only had time to present these 6 or 7 projects this morning.
How did you decide on who gets to present today in this segment?
The students decided themselves in a meeting we had in preparation for today. The meeting was a few days ago, with the idea being that all will present something this morning. You have many more projects ahead in the next 2 hours, so they mainly wanted to chose to present selected things that were their favorites.
Wow.
And
I'm
we
so
well, I might say, as you would know, Kelly, in each, at the end of each project, we have a very long formal presentation of each project with a different jury. And those are all a matter of record here at Tulane. So you're welcome to view those for the longer story, 4 hours of discussion of projects in the quarter.
That's my kind of movie night. Like, absolutely, I want to watch those. You guys were so impressive. Your graphics, your documentation, your chronology, change of title, ideas. It was all so clear, and it was wonderful to watch and hear everyone's perspective. And everyone brought a little something different. I noticed that. I, of course, have experience with most of these buildings, as you all will throughout your careers if you end up staying in New Orleans. These are kind of like the it buildings of the quarter. And I learned something from each of your presentations, so I really appreciate that. You know, I guess I'll just start from the top with your Creole Cottage presentation. I interned at the VCC, and it was extraordinarily valuable for me to eventually go into the financial incentives portion of historic preservation, like historic tax credits and things like that, because being able to identify those conditions that you pointed out is valuable for your clients. Creole cottages are especially important. You know, a lot of people want to, have like an open floor plan and things like that. But the way that you've described it in your presentation, you can describe that to clients, and people go nuts for that kind of information. And often when you educate them, they kind of want to keep with it, because they're like, oh, it's cool, we should keep it. All right, let's do that. And so, and I loved your map of identifying how many of the Creole cottages remain, largely in the residential section. I noticed, I liked your map of like the commercial part of the VCC and the residential. It was clear to identify and associate it with it. That was great. In your study, did you just find that there should be a continuation of them as residences, or are you finding maybe a different response in your study?
I believe that there is the possibility for both. as long as the commercial one is not doing too much damage to the structure, I think like people should continue to use them for both, because some areas where the cottages are, they're not, I don't think they're suitable for residential purposes because they're so close to other businesses. It wouldn't be fair to the residents. So I do think that they can continue to be both residential and commercial. But in terms for the commercial structures, I do think that a lot more care needs to be given to the actual structures to make sure that they actually last and that they still have some sort of integrity and some resemblance of the Creole cottage of what they were before.
Oh yes, and the VCC will make sure of that from the exterior perspective. And
also on the inside.
Yeah. Oh man, I mean the interior. You know, the use of historic tax credits and programs like that can kind of assist with the authentic renovations of historic structures, including Creole cottages. But if, you know, as of now, mostly they have free reign of interior changes. And you know, it's important for us to work with clients and educate them on the history of the architectural style, why it's important, what it's for. You know, people are looking for that. Very good.
Thank you.
Any of the other reviewers want to say something?
I'm in working on the French Quarter book. I've been looking at a lot of Zillow illustrations of buildings for sale in the quarter, and it's remarkable how they are destroying the interiors of these buildings, be they Creole cottages or anything else. I had a realtor take me into a building next door to a project I was working on, and she was just as proud as she could be of the interior of the building and wanted to know my opinion. I said, well, it's done over very nicely if you're on the Home and Garden channel. I said, but I have no idea that I'm in the French Quarter of the city of New Orleans. I said, this could be anywhere USA, and all sense of history, of place, of historic fabric have been wiped out. And it's very much a shame that it has happened. One of the other issues that possibly could have been looked at was there are a lot of Creole cottages in the quarter that have had second floors added to them. You've got this masonry base and a wood frame, usually late 19th century addition, when they are trying to make more housing for a lot of the Sicilian and Asian immigrants coming into the quarter during that particular period of time. I love those Creole cottages. They're great. And I would like to see more of the interior preservation of them moving forward. I don't know how you can do that. Tax credits or benefit in there, but most people that are buying these places in the quarter are from out of town. They just want a party place in there, and they want their conveniences to do their weekend stays in New Orleans for Jazz Fest and Mardi Gras and things like that. And that's very unfortunate. And I don't know how you begin to control that.
Hopefully on a social level, societal level, that's another question. But you have to live it, right? You have to live it and express it, encourage it in order to change the minds of others. But yeah, that's we don't need.
I do. I agree, and thank you, Kelly. You kind of hit the points that I was thinking. When is JL? Is that how you pronounce your name, JL?
Yes.
It was fantastic, and agreed. The map was great. I'm curious to see. Were all of those cottages always used as residences? Were they all homes, or were any of them used as commercial buildings at any point?
I am not sure on this front. I was only able, I could not find historic maps for all of them. So I didn't want to do like past usages on some and not all of them, because if I figured it would be more cohesive to have the information for all of them. So I didn't do that.
That map was fantastic to be able to see what is left. I think, yeah, you guys did a fantastic job collaborating. I mean, it was beautifully put together, which is how the French Quarter is, right? I mean, there's so, it's an active neighborhood. It's a real live living neighborhood. So Yeah, I don't know. Do we keep going for each student throughout, or should
Well,
we?
these
I
are
know there's a
just
time.
general comments and no order of any of the projects. We only have about 10 minutes for this set, and then we'll have some time at the end of the whole morning for more. But just things that stand out, questions, contributions that stand out.
So something I'm really curious about is for everybody. Did you all see the need for updated documentation? You did a fantastic job of pulling the research, like Kelly said, the chains of title, there were some very impressive ideas and obviously a thorough amount of research done. Did you see opportunities for any of these structures for updated documentation or current condition reports or treatment recommendation reports? That's kind of
add on to what Anne was saying. So a good theme that I was seeing with your presentation was an essence of preservation planning. Part of that is exploring what's already been done, the changes that have been made over time, who made them, what materials they are, what condition they're in. I saw the theme in almost every presentation about that. It starts there, and it's a good idea for any person who's taking on a historic structure to start with those basics. What's the history? What's that? And then going forward, what's an idea of preservation planning that you can implement? What are things to identify? And using, like Madam John's legacy as an example, you could start to see some of the deterioration over time, and they did this one in here. You can take the evidence from the past and use it to identify problems in the future. And it was perfect. It was wonderfully presented on almost everyone's presentation. But it's something that I think every client will need to know. It's highly educational. There's lots of things that we can learn from past deterioration. Because it'll happen again. It never stops.
Speaking to Anne's point, indeed, each student was expected to look at the past, the present situation as a basis for making recommendations for the future. And but that said, all could benefit from a new laser scan survey like we would love to do. And you'll see later in the morning where that kind of documentation has been done as part of the present project. Good point.
Another theme I noticed was this balance of authenticity versus updates. It especially hit home with the last presentation of Lafitte, because I think we all know that in the last renovation, there is kind of like the cutout for the stucco and the bricks revealed and things like that. And there's a modern like thirst for that kind of created history. And, it makes you question, authenticity in renovation versus creating false conditions. But however, on the other side, do you allow a little bit of that, in the modern fashions to create more interest? Like, is that how you kind of draw people in and then get them interested and educate them more? It was very interesting to question that throughout all of your presentations of how you balance authenticity, public interest, and modern updates. Robbie's probably very familiar with that.
I was going to say, Robbie, did you want to add any comments to that?
Well, that was a real tricky project because it was the Vieux-Carré Commission that could not agree on the philosophy there. Half of the commission wanted it fully stuccoed and preserved, and the wood, you talk about the disintegration of the wood and so forth, that was all to be addressed. Then half of the commission said, we've got this iconic building here and we need to keep it like Jean Lafitte is still in the building there, and we need this sort of faux sense of history. And I do not like Disneyland interpretations of things. I think you need to be honest about what you're doing there and interpret history the way it was, not the way Hollywood thinks that it should be interpreted there. And so that's a real challenge, is to, and sometimes you've got forces that are driving how buildings are interpreted beyond your control there.
Absolutely.
I had a question on the Pharmacy Museum. What are the upper floors currently being used for? Last I was in it, they were all empty. Is there any use to those upper floors currently, the entresol and on up?
So the entresol is being used as storage right now for other artifacts, and then the top floor is being used as offices currently. The first two are the museums. But they're having issues with the third floor with stabilization and just being able to get up there currently. So that was part of the plan, would be to stabilize that floor.
Codes are always a problem with these historic buildings. How do you bring a building built without codes up to current usage, meeting the codes? And that is always a challenge for any building in the quarter there. And even zoning, for example, I think it was recommended that at the Antoine's, the upper floors be used as a hotel. Hotels expansions are banned in the French Quarter by the CZO and the Ville Carré Commission. So you always have these challenges where you may have a creative idea, but you have other forces, be it code, be it zoning, whatever up in there to that you have to deal with. So it's always a balancing act with these historic buildings.
I thought that was fascinating about Antoine's, the amount of space that wasn't being used aside from storage. And yes, that the idea of, I thought it was a great idea, but that's a fair point about the restrictions placed on these buildings. And I was really curious. I think Ryan, you mentioned a sprinkler system that was installed at some point, and that, you know, when the proposal for the rooms and hotel for the top floors, I was wondering about those restrictions and codes that you know, if you have people staying overnight, it's a different story with that fire suppression system especially. I was really curious about that. And then I'm wondering if you were able to speak to some of the either the owner or the manager there about about this project and this idea. I mean, obviously you had access to the interior of it. So how did those conversations go?
Yeah, we were lucky enough to actually be able to talk to both the owner, Rick Blount, and the architect for the project over the past 20 years, Harvey Burns. Rick was not able to give us, or like not wanting to give us much information on his plans for the future of the building. But Harvey told us a lot about like the problems that they had and like trying to make all of this work and dealing with the complexities of like shifting levels between the two buildings and how do you conjoin these things, whether it's the upper levels or even on the main level of the building, trying to make everything like flow together properly. But there's for sure some issues, and Harvey had mentioned that they made a whole master plan at one point trying to figure out a way that they could get those upper levels occupiable, and that was the reason why they included an elevator through each of the floors of the buildings and did the fire suppression work. They weren't able to undertake a lot of I think that work due to whether it was like Hurricane Katrina or other problems such as COVID and whatnot.
So on that note, I will say the idea of talking to the architect, that's amazing that you were able to do that, the owners and the architects. One thing I will say is never overlook the maintenance guys and women. Absolutely, they have that firsthand knowledge 100%, and are usually very happy to share what they know, the work that they've done. I mean, it's something to be proud of, hopefully for the most part. So absolutely always try to find those people and ask them as many questions as you can about what they know.
And that's a perfect segue into Beauregard Kai's house, and highlighting the people other than the owners, the enslaved people who contributed to the building's utility, its beauty, and its use. So that anyway, I just wanted to highlight that. I just thought that was a wonderful part of the Beauregard Kai's presentation by Monica.
And in response, one of the joys of the job of teaching a course like this is planning the weekly events, and we kicked off the entire project one with lunch at Antoine's. We enjoyed the famous $22 lunch, and in the Rex room, no less.
Oh wow!
When the waiters elaborated on life in the famous restaurant, we had a total tour of the place, and others went upstairs all over the place and whatnot. Harvey Burns has done this in the past. That's why we have had this rare access to the upper floors. I might say that, Ed, that really toot the horn of another student here who didn't have time to present, but you should see the work that Ellen Faringa did for the future of Napoleon House, which is even more complex. She knocked it out of the park in terms of researching all the possibilities for utilizing underutilized spaces in the building, and all the way down to sizing air conditioning systems and figuring out where cooling towers would be and whatnot. Talking to experts all around the country on the subject. We really should send you her presentation on that. But what we're trying to do is take a hard look at the realities of operating and thus preserving these kinds of buildings in the quarter. And I was so glad that some of the students got so technical about it, because at the end, it's all about proper maintenance and they're being economically viable. Time for one or two more comments by our jury, and then we must move on.
Whenever I'm doing an assessment of a historic building, there's always certain questions I'm always asking. What is your cyclical maintenance plan? And I find most owners do not have that, and it's essential to have one. You need to prevent the issues from occurring rather than correcting the issues down the road. The second is, I always ask, what is your budget? Not for capital improvements, but for annual maintenance. And I'm just shocked that most owners do not have that. And while I always talk to the owner themselves or the director of the house museum or whatever it is, I always insist on talking to the maintenance department. They're going to give me the real issues. What are the problems? What they have to deal with on a daily basis. And I generally get more information from the people actually doing the work rather than the people up at the top, paying the salaries and doling the checks on out. So for any historic building, those are important things to have: a cyclical maintenance plan and an annual budget for the preservation of any historic structure.
Great intervention, Robbie. A good portion of your work is doing these conservation assessments, right? Looking at buildings for their health and prospects for the future. It's a big
Yes,
part
I just
of our
got back
work
from
going
Mobile
forward.
for the cathedral. They're doing the assessment there for them and to try to help them with the preservation of the cathedral in Mobile.
Yep, the preservationist as building doctor. Got it. All right.
I just
Any
want to
other-
add one last thing, if I may. I thank you all for that work. It was really, I can't say enough about how beautifully presented that was, and the collaboration. And my grandmother grew up on Barrack Street. Her father came from Sicily and tore down the house that was originally there and built another one in 1910. And my great aunt still lives in that house. So it is rare, I think, to have that many generations of people still living in the quarter. And I think y'all's presentations have really highlighted that it is a living neighborhood, that you have restaurants, you have shops, you have businesses, you have people living there, you have the churches, you have, all of those things. That was really well done. So thank you all very much for that.
That's lovely to hear, and thank you so much. And I might add before we move on that, of course, we had all kinds of talent helped this class along the way with the kickoff meeting by Daniel Hammer and a tour with including Anne Masson and others from VC Pura. So there were plenty of enrichments by experts in the field throughout the course of not this project, but all three. That's the whole point, is to meet professionals, hear different perspectives, and really see what's behind the scenes here with these various buildings and projects. So thanks to those other helpers to this course as well, as we and credit to them too for the quality of these presentations. We really had a great time working with colleagues in the field in this class. Okay, I think Tony is probably sending signals to me to move on in our presentation. If everybody can take a little breath, and we need to shift over to project 2, which is preservation planning in Thibodaux, Louisiana. It's a double header, if you will. The first one is on past, present, and future of downtown Thibodaux, and the other that's a complement to this is past, present, and future of nearby Laurel Valley Plantation. So we'll start with the downtown Thibodaux team, please.
Hi, everyone. So yes, like John said, we'll be talking about preservation planning for urban landscapes in downtown Thibodaux, Louisiana. And we'll start with kind of a summary of our documentation. Next slide, please. Yeah, so we'll talk about documentation, historical research, and some analysis of the downtown area. Next, please.
Hi, my name is Tess, and I worked with Tomas Martin to develop a timeline for Thibodaux. The timeline begins in the 18th century with the arrivals of Creoles in the area, shortly followed by Acadians. It's in this time that they begin to import slaves for sugarcane production. The town got its name from Henry Thibodaux and was originally known as Thibodauxville before the name was shortened in 1838. One of the main buildings in Thibodaux is the Lafourche Parish Courthouse, which was designed by architect Henry Howard and built in 1861. By 1865, Thibodaux had established itself as a regional agricultural trading center. And later in 1887 was the Thibodaux Massacre, which took place outside of the historical district of Thibodaux, but is considered within the cultural district. The massacre of at least 60 was a reaction to a union of Black sugarcane workers that went on strike. This tragedy discouraged unionization and set back the progress of rights for Black people in the area by decades. In the 1930s, Thibodaux added oil to its trading operations and gained the status of an oil boomtown. And something to note is the bicentennial in 1976 was to the funding of preservation projects such as the survey of Laurel Valley that a group goes into in further detail later. And according to the 2020 census, Thibodaux currently has 15,948 residents. Next.
This is a map of downtown Thibodaux. Thibodaux is located near the bayou and not from Nicholls State University, which can be seen on the lower left-hand corner of the map. The area of Thibodaux that we focused on is within the local historic district, which is highlighted in gray. Next slide. This is a zoomed in version of the map of Thibodaux. It focuses on the area near the bayou. The majority of our interventions take place in this area, specifically along Green Street and 3rd Street, which are two major axes. Labeled 1 through 4 are the buildings that are chosen for adaptive reuse proposals and will be discussed in further detail later on in the presentation.
In looking at downtown Thibodaux, it was important that we also consider building use and when also considering adaptive reuse. So this is a breakdown between institutional, residential, commercial, and vacant buildings. Next. And then we further broke down commercial buildings, and you can see that there are a lot of offices, mostly law offices in downtown Thibodaux. Next, please. And then we also broke down the vacant and empty spaces or unknown spaces, and you can see how much parking is visible or available in downtown Thibodaux. Next.
So this map shows the current conditions of the buildings in downtown Thibodaux. As you can see, Most of the buildings are in pretty good condition followed by a couple of them being fair, meaning that they're habitable, but they need some maintenance. And then scattered around are some poor, and then some buildings that are also demolished. So yeah, next.
So we recommend having 2 pedestrian malls on 3rd Street. Next slide, please. So you can see here, this would involve cutting off traffic from Jackson Street to St. Philip Street and St. Philip Street to Green Street. So these would just create outdoor spaces for community gathering, and they have many different uses. So they can be farmers markets, small festivals, live music, community events, gathering, meeting spaces, seating, shopping, and lots of benefits. So decreased noise from decreased traffic. So cooling through increased shade and vegetation, pedestrian friendly community feel, and just centralizing this area on 3rd Street as a community center and bringing in students from nearby Nichols and community members. Next slide, please. So these are some precedents that it looks at. So 3 kind of different ones. So Second Sundays on King Street is a temporary pedestrian mall, but has been very successful. And a lot of farmers markets and little pop-ups downtown Charleston, Virginia. This is popular because there's a college nearby and students love coming and hanging out here and having a pretty outdoor space between these commercial centers. And downtown Savannah has a pedestrian walk along the waterway and next to these shops. And this has been very successful. It's just really providing a space, an outdoor space where there can be a community program. Next slide. So you can see the site in red, so the pedestrian malls, and how this connects to the rest of the city. So public bus routes, the city's previously proposed pedestrian bike path, and the new pedestrian bike path that we propose, and the waterfront path that we also will propose. Next slide. So current conditions, just walking down the street, you can see what it looks like now. Definitely needs some vegetation, little work. Next slide. So these would just be permanent uses. So lots of games, seating, tables, and just a lot of amenities to come and hang out outdoors in these areas. Next slide, please. So temporary programming. So this would really just open up space for so many events. So I have the 2022 calendar of events for Thibodaux, and a lot of these could actually take place at these proposed pedestrian malls. So you can see they have a lot of art festivals, they have crawfish boils, live music. You can have community workout events and just a place to really have just community events programming. Next slide, please.
So for the first part of the project, we'll talk about some of the adaptive reuse projects.
The first adaptive reuse project is the oil and gas building located at 206 Green Street, which is across from the courthouse. This building is currently owned by Matt Ory, who is a personal injury and hurricane claims lawyer in Louisiana. The proposal for this building, which accommodates the tax incentives for rehabilitation, converts this old bank building into a flagship law office in Thibodaux. This slide examines the building in elevation as it looks today. The building features a section on the right side that is covered with green metal cladding. The proposal removes the metal covering and converts the newly opened space on the second floor into a habitable terrace. Next slide. The proposal seeks to open up the interior, allowing natural light to permeate the building, and shifts the interior walls to create a more ordered and logical division of space. Tailored specifically to Matt Ory's law practice, there are 6 lawyers' offices on the ground floor and second floor combined, offices for the paralegals that are found on the second floor. The second floor also features an outdoor terrace and a large conference room at the front of the building. This conference room looks out towards the courthouse across the street and is separated from the rest of the office by switchable glass, a product that can be either opaque or transparent depending on the flip of a switch. This room, when is not in use, the 3 large windows provide light to the building and a unique view of the courthouse. Next slide. Here are sections that express some of the most noticeable changes of the proposal: the movement of the walls that open up the lobby and the creation of the second floor conference room and the outdoor terrace. Next. This first rendering shows the view of the conference room upon exiting the elevator on the second floor, looking out towards the courthouse. Next. And this rendering is a view from the hall that leads to the stairs, looking towards the paralegal offices. As you can see, each paralegal has their own cubicle that is enclosed by glass. The windows between each cubicle, which are above eye height, act in a manner similar to clerestory windows, in that light will be able to pass through while maintaining a sense of privacy. Next. Thank you.
So I've chosen to look at the public defender's office located on the corner of West 2nd Street and Green Street. Here's a site plan with the building highlighted in orange. Matt Ori owns both buildings on either side of the structure, one of which is an apartment complex and the second being the oil and gas building, providing a unique spot for connections. As you can see, it has quite a banal exterior, so I've put together a few ideas to spark inspiration for the possible future. Next slide. Here I've zoomed into the site plan. The building still marked in orange. It's situated, as I said, along Green Street, which is an important access in the downtown district, with the parish courthouse located right across the street. To the north, just a block away, is the riverfront where a pedestrian bridge between the downtown area and commercial hotspots across the river is being explored later in the presentation. This building provides a unique opportunity, in my opinion, for a staple structure and program that aids in activating the street life of downtown Thibodaux. Next slide. So here's a view showing the direction of flow from the waterfront and the potential pedestrian bridge. This just further reemphasizes how prime this location is to draw people in. Next slide. So here's a precedent I've been looking at. A program that seems needed and that seems as though it would be successful is a structure that offers both live music, food, and drinks. Green Hall is a dance hall located in the center of Green, a city in Texas that arguably puts the city on the map. It's a picture hotspot for tourists that functions as a concert hall featuring local artists and a bar. It has a casual and comfortable feel that serves both the locals and tourists. Next slide. So firstly, one feasible option is to have local artists contribute to adding wall murals on the exterior facade. This could add color and catch pedestrians' eyes. I would imagine this being a comfortable, cool spot that draws people in, and I would propose the possibility of an atrium roof that would bring some light into the windowless concert space. Next slide. Secondly, I would imagine a steel facade being added to the exterior of the building. This could speak with some of the other renovations happening in the area right now. I would additionally propose some sort of rooftop bar that would provide fantastic views of the courthouse and create an extremely desirable place that's not featured in the downtown area presently.
During our visits to Thibodaux, I became interested in the block between 1st and 3rd Street and the potential to develop a way through the block. I've identified 3 potential buildings on that block highlighted in red that could be used to create this connection. Next. The 2 buildings on 3rd Street are the main focus of the proposal, offering opportunities to utilize the ground floor program in a public way to bring people through to the other side of the block. The top elevation shows what the current street looks like and highlights 2 buildings of focus. The lower elevation begins to show that the proposed changes do not require a dramatic change to the street face to achieve the permeability. For example, the left building would preserve the exterior wrapper and utilize the existing language of doors to welcome pedestrians off the street. Matt Ori's building on the right could open up one or both of the bays on the ground floor to be used in a similar way. I've also suggested that continuing the language of the left building wrapper over to the right would unite the 2 visually, communicating that their programs work together. Next. We were fortunate enough to see inside of the right-hand building belonging to Matt Ori. Seeing the interior of the demoed space reaffirmed the potential of the bays on the ground floor, leading to a courtyard in the back that could be used for a connection to the empty lot on the other side. Next. After identifying these spaces in the 2 buildings, I think there's an opportunity to create a small market scale place that encourages people to move through. The food court shown on the left begins to show the idea of how food fronts create an enjoyable path through the space. That example is on a larger scale, but perhaps Thibodeau could have pod vendors like the center image that cater to local style and cuisine. These spaces would be a great opportunity for culinary students from Nichols to start their own local restaurant at a lower cost. Additionally, these markets could have a farmers market component for local farmers and artisans to sell their goods. Next. Pod vendors and more formal food and drink services could go in the left building, which offers more space for seating within the structure and leads directly to the back lot, which could be used as an overflow eating and relaxation space. The right building has a more controlled pathway through the block and lends itself to the smaller market proposal. Creating these opportunities at the ground level would achieve the permeability goal of the block and allow owners of the building to utilize the upper levels for other purposes. Next, thank you.
Okay, so here are a few of the proposed elevations within the context of Greater Thibodaux at 1/16 inch scale. This is at the oil and gas building by Clara, and it's alongside the west elevation of Mary Apseth's Public Defender's Office on Green Street. Then below that is the downtown garage, which was done by Tomas. Next slide, please. And then at a smaller scale, first we have the project which I installed, which was the welcome sign on the pleat on First Street. We also have just below that, we have the north elevation of the Public Defender's Office. We also have Tess Temple's south elevation and her adaptive reuse project on 3rd Street. Next slide, please. So going into my project, this was sort of unraveled during the production of all of this. I discovered that the pleat, which is the planter between 1st, 2nd, and St. Philip Street, just kind of stood as unavailing, sort of idle. Since one of the project objectives was to connect the Bayou waterfront to the rest of downtown Thibodaux, I felt that leaving that pleat there just as is would not be achieving that objective, given the pleat's location and geography. So for me, there was nothing better than just like a place marker at that location, which is the junction between the Bayou and the downtown area. Given the pleat's diagonal geometry, I decided on designing a convex 20-foot, 6-inch long sign constructed of the native Louisiana petrified wood with the name Thibodaux, and the outline of the state. We also have the town's nickname, Queen City Lafourche, cut from core and steel right below that sign. Next slide.
All right, so we'll kind of get into talking about the waterfront revitalization and how this is a key component to preservation planning in downtown Thibodaux. Next slide, please. So we started with looking at some of the history specifically related to the Bayou and found lots of great imagery of the Bayou throughout the years. Next slide, please.
So we looked at the existing conditions, and the waterfront has a lot of potential, but needs major improvements to make this an amenity to the public. Some of the examples is that it's just overgrown with vegetation, insufficient lighting, has no crosswalks, and provides little protection between the cars and the pedestrians. And so we're hoping with this water revitalization to improve those things. Next slide.
As mentioned before, the sides of the bayou are kind of overgrown with trees on some areas and then kind of empty with nothing on it. So one of the things that I looked at was the vegetation and how to improve the site, like the view of the bayou and the view from the bayou. So I decided to implement some of these vegetations that would add to the beauty of the bayou, also make it more inviting. Next, please. So looking at the section over here, on top, you can see a current view of the bayou. To the right is downtown Thibodaux, and then to the left is the other side with all of the big box stores. Right now, the side of the bayou looking at downtown Thibodaux is very steep and underutilized. And my proposal was to kind of make it more inviting so that people would use the sides of the bayou more. So looking at the image, looking at the section below, you can see what I'm proposing. On the side of the big box store, which is to the left, introducing stairs that lead to the bayou that can flood. but that also serve as a sitting area for people to fish along the bayou. And then to the right, introducing smaller trees and other vegetation that can retain the soil so that it doesn't so to protect the soil when it rains so that it doesn't just fall into the bayou. So in the end, you have a view of downtown Thibodaux from the stairs, and then you also have a view from the other side of the bayou as well. Next.
And to create this connection between Nicholls State University and the municipal complex, that's our main goal. We are proposing 3 bridges. Next slide, please. These are the locations of the 3 bridges, and they would be pedestrian and bike bridges. One of them creating the access from Green Street across the bayou, and then 2 mirroring the already existing vehicular bridges that on Canal Boulevard and the other one. And then we would create community involvement through holding a competition that would involve community voting, and then also promote strong design through that competition, and also involving artists instead of just having a standard design bridge. Next, please.
So for the development of a pedestrian trail and some amenities that would round out everything that we've talked about so far, we originally proposed a phased process that would ultimately lead up to this plan where all of the parking along the bayou would be eliminated, allowing for a bike lane and an expansive walkway along the bayou. And this would be supplemented by additional parking in the brown box at the bottom that would supplement all of the parking spaces that would have been eliminated along the bayou. Next, please.
So in this section, you can see the bridge connecting downtown Thibodaux and Thibodaux, and between the bayou and the cars, you can see there's now ample amount of space for bike racks, a pedestrian walkway, and a bike path. This just allows for a safer environment for pedestrians and bikers, and to make it more inviting for people to come down to the bayou. And then on the other side, you can see a similar situation with a pedestrian pathway. Also, new vegetation and plantings are introduced to replace the overgrown vegetation currently there. Next slide. And this is just a visual of what we imagine the bayou could be, with the pedestrian access on either side of the bayou and the bridge connecting the 2 sides. As kind of said earlier, there's just been this desire to connect the Nicholls campus to the municipal complex, and we thought that enhancing the connection by creating a loop along the bayou would help improve that, because it can offer a variety of benefits and amenities. It can also serve as a little amenity on its own, while also connecting it to the grand picture of connecting Nicholls campus to the municipal complex. Next slide. And thank you to everyone who helped out with this project.
Good. That was a summarization of the a lot of additional work that was done for downtown Thibodaux. Here we had a kind of a guest host in the form of the developer Matt Ori and others working in the region, like John Lafargue and David Plater, who were stakeholders and long-term residents who were very interested in working with us and sharing all that they knew about the place, with an interest in improving the situation in downtown Thibodaux as well. So, a great example of a project where we're trying to listen to the project and listen to the owners, the stakeholders, toward helping out with some useful ideas. Comments about the Thibodaux downtown project. I think that Kelly has been a consultant, in fact, to Matt Ori. So would you lead us off, please?
All of Matt Ori's buildings, I've been working with him on it, and it's fun and fascinating to see it through your eyes, because Matt's been wonderful. I think he's such a visionary for Thibodaux and has so many great ideas. He's the exact kind of person that any town needs to move things forward, bring excitement. And he has even more ideas for downtown. While we were walking around, some of the things you guys were bringing up was like, you know, he's thinking about it too. But my role with Matt Ori is his historic tax credit consultant for the oil and gas building and for 607 West 3rd Street. And in first meeting with him, it was via Danielle Stein, who I think is the, I forget her downtown district director, something like that. And while we're discussing all of these, the issue is not coming from people's, like the public, it's coming from the logistics of local government and getting these ideas passed through those eyes. I think that there's maybe a difference of priorities on a local government level, or maybe a hierarchy, and this hasn't been a priority for some time. I don't know all the details, but there's not that they don't care, but they have other issues, and so we're coming across a lot of those barriers in order to move forward. And it's interesting, but I mean, Thibodaux has so many great things. I'm so excited to see that this project has been highlighted. We need to post this everywhere. We're posting on Facebook, we're posting this presentation everywhere. I think people are going to get fired up. Thibodaux people are going to get fired up. Has the mayor seen this? I think the mayor needs to see this.
Oh, yes. Mr. Ori is wanting us to present it to the public in a 300-seat theater at Nichols State University. And lots of locals saw us walking around and tried to help us out as well with this project. So brings us back to the theory of the whole work. Real world, full-time, full-scale work in the field that we hope will make a difference. Thank you, Kelly. Other observations about what do you think about the waterfront redevelopment? We all are aware that so many American cities have turned their backs to the water, the raison d'etre for their existence. And this is a classic example of how great, famous, significant Bayou Lafourche has been, in its role and aesthetic, has been ignored in the modern handling of this town. So that was an original idea here for connecting the water to the city in a more effective way. And they're proposing bridges to connect both sides as part of that solution. What do you all think of that?
I loved seeing that, getting back to that connection. I mean, that is, like you said, it's why the town is there. So that connection back to the water, and that's something that I would think most of the residents would very much value and appreciate. I loved seeing the opportunities for recreation along the bayou right there. I mean, you have people fishing in the bayou. You have, you know, it's fantastic, and I love the connection, especially with it being a college town, kind of the connection with and the opportunities for students in that area. That was great to see. I did want to ask about the vegetation along the bayou. It looked like most of those were native trees and shrubs. I just wanted to ask about that. I saw dogwood on there. JL, I think you had presented that part of it. Did you all look at intact native species along the bayou and what works well there, and keeping that ecosystem intact?
So when I was doing the research for what would be best for along the bayou, I was looking at the LSU guideline that they once had, like, of native trees for Southern Louisiana. And then I was looking at the trees that could withstand like flooding and those that could withstand different types of temperature. And the ones that I chose was basically those that felt like right in the middle that would survive, basically. So my proposal is introducing them along what is already there on the bayou, making sure that we're introducing more native stuff, but also keeping what's already there.
And yeah, I like that. And I like the idea, when I looked at it, what I was thinking was it also, it gives the shade, obviously, for people. It also kind of could act as a screening. And when you talked about taking some of those parking spaces away right on the bayou like that, and relocating those, the idea of screening the big box side of things was appealing, I think.
Oh, credit to Jael too for even examining the kind of fish that are in the bayou that were in the bayou that could be returned. So she really looked at the subject matter, the natural
it's really
history.
important. That's fantastic. The bigger context, that is something that's really, really important. So that's well done.
Thank you.
I agree. Incorporating landscape. I think we've all seen when landscape is taken away, what is also taken away is a sense of place and enjoyment. And like Anthony was, talking about placemaking with his sign, this component is also a placemaking feature. Landscape is extremely important, and the bayou does take up a lot of, real estate, so to say. And by creating this developed ecology, you kind of, you put it back into use in some way. And there's more engagement, use, and enjoyment of the bayou, appreciation. And yeah, like Anne, you were saying about connecting the students of the university. I mean, that could be just kind of like, instead of taking a bite, let's take the canoe down to downtown and then dock it over there, go to the rooftop bar over at the public defender's office, and then let's take it back, It's great. It's all encompassing. It creates a journey. Like, it's great.
Yeah, absolutely. And that was another, I thought, really, really fantastic idea. I think Mary had presented that, the concert hall, the music hall.
Or the farmer's market along 3rd Street, whatever. Yeah.
I don't normally jump in, but I just think it's really important to mention, in case she isn't going to, that Ann Finney spent a lot of time in our college years in Thibodeau, on the weekends to see her brother, who was a musician, playing in the downtown clubs and nightclubs as well. Another reason why I was excited that she'd be a respondent for these 3 particular projects, but I did wonder if you would, kind of hone in on this programmatic, these programmatic elements, because of the, amount of interest and familiarity you have with it in that aspect.
This bigger, yeah, Tony, I mean, it is. And this bigger urban planning, it's not my wheelhouse, but definitely knowing the opportunities in Thibodeau, and when we would go out there for the weekends, hanging out, there are opportunities for more things to be happening in Thibodeau, for sure. I mean, it's a great place, with a lot of great architecture, and I think people would be really, especially the students, like we're saying, I think would be very, very excited about this.
Speaking of architecture, Daniel Stein and I were thinking of how we could possibly have kind of a vacant building open house, and really inviting people to come in, investors, architects, things like that, and maybe do like a foray, over the course of a day, and be like, we have these buildings open, please come in, look at them, in hopes of just kind of opening up the opportunities to the public. Because there are quite a few vacant buildings, as your graphic talked about.
I like the fact that there were both day and night activities programmed into the downtown area, which makes downtowns very viable. I also like the tie back to the bayou there, which I think is great. I did have a question though. Is there a historic commission down there that projects have to go before, or is that just up to developers to do what they want?
there is a commission, and Matt Ori said ignore them. He can't work with them. They're impossible. They don't work very hard. So we chose to ignore them. Not really. We do know that the commission is aware of this project, but we didn't consult them so heavily as we might have.
I was just wondering whether they had any feedback to the concepts being proposed there or not, because ultimately you've got to deal with them.
Yeah, seriously, we were wanting to do things that we think would be of interest and acceptable to them, that I think you see in these various proposals. I would like to say one thing that would be an eye-opener for this group would be the decision of a design for a bridge. Personally, I think it's a place to do a really cool bridge that might even be a moment in engineering history. Who knows? Why not have an international competition for a bridge here and have a real zinger of a bridge design where new design can really help put a place on the map. So the students looked at bridges by engineering superstars like Calatrava and others that might go there. Why not?
It's a great opportunity to have an iconic structure there. It'll, it'll be tying the new and the old together nicely.
Yeah, great idea.
Are there some drawbridges along Bayou Lafourche there for shrimp boats? Right? I mean, what's the size of the boats coming through? Is it limited in the downtown area, or would there be limitations?
Where the like right there in that area, the bridges don't open at all, and there's actually a bunch of pillars, so like only the smallest of boats I think can pass through.
Okay.
So like eventually ideally the pedestrian bridges would open up so that we could create that connection, but the vehicular bridges would have to be redone in that case.
Okay, thank you. I do also just want to say, when we were talking about you guys possibly presenting this in Thibodeau, that is something that you likely will have throughout your careers, is that public engagement. That is a big part of my job for the federal government, is depending on the scale of the project, you have public comment that you have to take into consideration. I think it's incredibly helpful. I love the public comment period. A lot of people don't love it, but you get some really, really interesting feedback. 300 people would be a little intimidating, but I think it would be really well received. And I think the more you can kind of get that under your belt, the better.
Good advice. Good advice. In the interest of time, we must move on. We have in the agenda for the day a 10-minute break. Could we abbreviate that to 5 to have a little stretch break, and then we'll continue with Thibodeau Part 2, Laurel Valley. How's that? So have a 5-minute stretch break and we'll regroup. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Tony, just let me know you want me to get started.
Let's, I think we can reconvene to have the second part of today's presentation of Studio 2 Urban Conservation as taught at Tulane University, dealing with urban conservation examples in the South Louisiana region. Our following presentation will be on past, present, and future preservation prospects for Laurel Valley Plantation near Thibodaux, Louisiana.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Professor. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Very
All right,
good.
great. Yeah, I'm Robert. I'm happy to introduce our presentation on Laurel Valley Plantation. The plantation and plantation store and village sit just a few miles from downtown Thibodaux, but as you will see shortly, it's a vastly different project than that presented by our classmates a few minutes ago. Next slide, please. In addition to our wonderful professors, we had a lot of help with the Thibodaux and Laurel Valley community, namely the McKee family, Paul Leslie, Malcolm Hodnett, and of course, I'm not sure if she's still here, but Mia Kaplan for her great work on Laurel Valley was an inspiration to us as well. Next slide, please. We've had a wide range of projects and efforts in our group, and we've connected them in a way we hope makes the most amount of sense, beginning, of course, with an extensive introduction, placement, history, and composition of the plantation and site through the history of sugar, what they do at the site today in terms of visiting, and then extensive conditions assessments and photography before moving on to centralized site recommendations, in which we kind of combine these earlier efforts on research and documentation into things the site can do to maintain itself in the near, medium, and long term. And then we zoom in on some of these recommendations in our special projects section at the end with some content we hope you'll enjoy. Next slide, please.
Okay, so site placement and history. Laurel Valley is a sugar plantation. Next slide. It's located about 4 miles down by Lafourche from downtown Thibodaux. It's the largest surviving 19th and 20th century sugar plantation complex in the US. Next. Here's a map of the large site. The plantation was settled facing the bayou. The plantation store is at the front of the property. There are large sugarcane fields on the property, and there's a pocket of structures in the middle, commonly known as the village. Next. So here's the village of Laurel Valley Plantation. Next. There's a big house in front of the residences. Also near the residences is the remains of a sugar mill used to process the sugar cane grown on the property. Next. And here are images of the workers' dwellings, which is a large portion of the remaining material of the property. Next. And here is a layout of the structures at the site. Next. So there were several expansions of the site over time. First, double houses were constructed, then the sugar mill. Then after emancipation, doubles with additions known as Creole T were constructed, and then several rolls of singles were constructed in the 1890s. Additionally, there were boarding houses over towards the mill, and you'll hear more about the mill's expansion and history in a minute. Next. So here's a comprehensive timeline. Of note was the 1820s, when the Americans moved into the area behind the Acadians who originally settled the area. Joseph Tucker was one such American who moved to this property, but it was in the back of present-day Laurel Valley. And then in the 1830s, he pressured to buy the land in front of him with bayou access. He purchased it and he established Laurel Valley. In the 1840s, the oldest exit structures were constructed on the site, as well as the sugar mill was constructed in about 1845. The Tucker family retained the land until the Civil War, when the original big house on the site was burned by Union soldiers. And I'll hand it off to Noah to talk a bit more about the history of the sugar mill.
Good morning. My name is Noah Epstein. I studied the history of sugar production in Louisiana. Next slide, please. The first granulated sugar produced in Louisiana was in 1795. On the left, the first sugar kettle ever used in Louisiana, now a public art piece on the LSU campus. On the right, a sugar kettle used at Laurel Valley, shown here in this hair photograph. In the following centuries, the crop came to define not just Louisiana, but the entire world. Next slide, please. This slide shows the enormous increase in sugar production over the centuries of production in Louisiana, chilling evidence of the monoculture and mechanization that dominates contemporary production of sugar in Louisiana. Next slide, please. This timeline outlines technological advances in the sugar industry. I want to read a brief quotation from B.W. Hickman's seminal treatise, The Sugar Revolution. Unlike the more broadly based revolutions, the sugar revolution points to the transformative power of a single commodity, resulting in what has sometimes been termed crop determinism. Next slide, please. This graph compares the amount of sugar produced and the number of active mills. The Civil War decimated the sugar industry in Louisiana, but it rebounded over the next 20 years. In the 1890s, the number of sugar mills contracted again, this time due to mechanization and economies of scale. It is telling that there are now only 11 sugar refineries in the state of Louisiana, yet these few enormous refineries produce many, many times more sugar than 1,000 refineries used to produce. The history of Laurel Valley is inextricably tied with sugar, as the growing of sugarcane and the production of granulated sugar has defined the history of the site for nearly 200 years. Most of the land on the plantation is still used to cultivate sugarcane, although it is now processed at a refinery in town, Lafourche Sugars, instead of at the site. Next slide, please. The Laurel Valley Sugar Mill is emblematic of the history of sugar production in Louisiana, with each estate originally processing the sugarcane grown on site. These photographs show the sugar house at the peak of its production when it dominated the landscape, an enormous 3-story building connected by light rail to not only the fields of Laurel Valley, but also 3 other plantations. This is in keeping with the history of sugar production, with economies of scale first necessitating the combination of plantations into central processing. Laurel Valley had among the most modernized and efficient sugar houses in the state, producing all grades of granulated sugar along with molasses. Next slide, please. This last graph illustrates average sugar production over 6 decades. Like many of the sugar houses in Louisiana, the Laurel Valley Sugar House was rendered inoperable by the Civil War. But like most sugar houses in Louisiana, in the 3 decades following the war, it was modernized and expanded. It took 30 years after the war for production of granulated sugar to eclipse the pre-Civil War averages. Next slide, please, and I'm going to hand it off.
Awesome. Thank you, Noah. Tony, you can go to the next slide. This is a super quick section, but we just wanted to cover how the site functions today. And it's connected basically to what Noah said. It's overwhelmingly used as an active sugar plantation with outsourcing most of the operations rather than conducting them internally. There is an informal and irregular tour system conducted by ownership of the property for kind of a nominal fee. And then their other supplemental stream for keeping the site maintained is movie production, the number of motion pictures in the site recently. Next slide, I'm gonna hand off to Tiffany.
Alrighty, so I did a conditions assessment for the Laurel Valley Village. Next. In 1975, our professor, John Stubbs, actually did a 3-volume documentation of Laurel Valley, including assessing the conditions of all structures on the site. So I decided to build upon this research and do a conditions assessment for the site today and compare the data from John's 1975 survey to a 2020 conditions to assess the change over time of structures and materials. John also mapped and gave each building a reference number, so I retained this number system for my survey as well. Next. So I completed the survey on the 123 app. For each structure, I collected a reference number, geolocation, structure type, overall condition, and extensive photographs of each structure. Next. So as I mentioned earlier, there are 3 prevalent house types at Laurel Valley: the Creole Double, the Creole with Addition, also known as the Creole T, and the Shotgun. There are also several other human shelters in the site that don't fall into one of these categories, such as a unique dog trot house that there's one of, or the schoolhouse on the property. So I surveyed those as well. Next. When making a decision of what condition rating to give the structure, I developed a rating system that was based on the damage and materials I saw on the site itself, as well as following along with John's rating conditions as well. So excellent is defined as the structure has an intact porch, chimney, roof, and siding. Structure is safely accessible. Good is an overall intact porch and chimney, as well as little as if any damage to siding or roof. Fair is the structure has light damage to siding or roof and moderate damage to chimney or porch. Deteriorated is the structure has severe structural damage, such as wall, roof, and foundation failure. And destroyed is a building that is currently collapsed on the property or a blank lot where a building once existed. Next. So after I conducted the survey, I was able to compile the data and compare the change in conditions at Laurel Valley over time. So here's an aerial of the village. Next. And here are conditions from 1975. There's lots of good and fair ratings of the structures. And next, here are the current conditions. So there's lots of deteriorated and destroyed buildings. Next, and this slide is to show the loss of structures that are completely gone on the site that occurred over the last 50 years. Since 1975, 19% of village structures have been lost at Laurel Valley. Next. So this graphic shows the number of fair rated buildings has rapidly declined over time, and deteriorated or destroyed buildings have increased in the last 50 years. Next. And this graphic I found really interesting because it shows the loss in structures by house type or structure type. So this data shows the shotgun house type has suffered the most loss on site. The shotgun house type lost 27% of its structures, while other house types lost only 7 to 8% of their structures maximum. So the data on this slide could be expanded further to see why shotguns, even though they're some of the youngest structures on the site, they're experiencing the most loss. And it could be expanded further to see if it's a materials difference, a construction difference, or something unknown. And I think using analysis to try to piece this together could be a good next step in understanding material loss in the village site and conditions over time. Next.
Hello, I'm Monica Davis. I'm utilizing Tiffany's condition assessment data collection. I created an architectural database that includes the following information. Next slide, please. It includes site location, structural type, material integrity, condition assessments in 1975 versus this year, material covering, foundation, and roof shape. This is a resource that can be used immediately by the Laurel Valley staff to assist in building sustainability. The information is vital to understanding the architectural significance of the site. The Excel database can be uploaded to a GIS mapping system and to understand the site patterns and suggest future recommendations. Next slide, please. This is an excellent example of the National Park Service that has utilized GIS software to educate their tourism population and to also inform new and current staff members of the building's history. This too can be implemented on the Laurel Valley Plantations website. Next slide, please. This is a series of graphs that can be generated from the database. This Excel is ready to hand off to the plantation staff, and more information can be inputted as necessary to document the architectural significance of each structure on the site. Next slide, please. This is also in the 1975 current conditions. So you can see at that time was a large amount of fair conditions at that time. Next slide, please. And then how that has kind of changed through the current 2022 data, current conditions of the site. So fair is 23, good, and then we have deteriorated. Next slide, please.
Hello, my name is Eric Spinrad, and in conjunction with this Laurel Valley conditions assessment and the architectural database, a photographic documentation was conducted to visually record the individual buildings, and the full contents of this photographic documentation ended up into an appendix, so it can be referred to at a later date. Next slide, please. When looking at the Laurel Valley Plantation, I found it very fascinating to think about not only the rows of houses, but the reason for those rows of houses being the rows of sugarcane, and how these are all part of the same process of sugar production and the plantation landscape. Next slide, please. So I also used the numbering system from the 1975 survey conducted by John Stubbs. The reasoning behind that was that it would reduce confusion and allow easy comparison between the original survey and this 2022 assessment. Next slide, please. Photographic documentation is a cost and time-effective way to gather information on current existing conditions. Different knowledge can be extrapolated from varying ways of recording. As with surveys conducted by the HABS or the HARES surveys, so the Historic American Engineering Record, as seen below there. Also, new technologies such as drone technology and 3D laser scanning, as used by Mia Kaplan, can also allow for detailed modeling and new perspectives. Next slide, please. So presented here is the photographic documentation of the front elevations of the buildings along Laurel Valley Road. The images quickly show changes as well as the conditions within that landscape. You can see the destroyed buildings from Hurricane Ida, which are C4 and C8, as well as the building that suffered from a fire in C3. Next slide, please. Here's an example of building D6 in which 4 elevations were documented. The photographic documentation then can be easily given placement through the original 1975 map. And the following slides we're going to look at are the photo documentation of this conducted March 9th and March 18th of 2022 at Laurel Valley Plantation. So the next slide here, you'll see a couple different types of structures, and they're all labeled again, just so you can place this against the map. Next slide. I also captured the documentation of the collapsed and destroyed buildings as well. I thought this was important to see its original footing and placement, but also to just try to get one last look at these before they're maybe gone. Next slide, please. So in the end, by capturing these photographic images, the intent was to document the existing fabric for future study. And in case of many more of these buildings get lost to time. And I also recommend that future documentation be conducted, for example, every 5 years in fragile environments such as Laurel Valley Plantation. Next slide, please. So after this assessment and the conditions assessments as well, recommendations for intervention were made. Next slide, please. So 2 of the biggest were stabilization, so mitigating the decay of the structures to increase their longevity, as well as stewardship, so preservation through routine and systematic maintenance. Stabilization itself, really important because a lot of these are against a test of time. One big one was the use of hurricane straps. This was a suggestion by John Stubbs in a discrete manner to really give extra support to these buildings. In the next slide, I also looked at the mill, which is very important to telling the story of the Laurel Valley Plantation and the process of sugar production. And Ryan goes into this much further in a really good part of our presentation here, but generally just removal of debris, repointing and tuck pointing, so there isn't any further collapse. Salvage of any mill equipment that could be put into exhibits and educational purposes in the future, and then just the curation of that landscape and ruin. Thank you.
Okay, so what we've done here is kind of combine everything you've just heard and everything you will hear into some sort of centralized recommendations process. And I've further condensed this down for this shorter presentation today into one graphic. So Tony, you can go to the next slide, please, just to hit the high points. But we've divided our focus areas into infrastructure, tours, and business practices, and kind of applied time limits to those in the short, medium, and long term. So what we're kind of in now is the documentation and modeling phase with, of course, research and database analysis for the tour side. I think Laurel Valley on the business side needs to adopt a formal plan to commit to these sorts of timelines and goals, even if it's not these specifically, just more of an example. The medium term things like redesigning circulation pathways through the site, formalizing a tour process and expanding staffing. So the ownership isn't the one doing the tours, there's someone whose job it is. And then perhaps spinning off the village, the structures we've covered into a separate business entity than the plantation business itself. And then moving into the long term, activating the bayou frontage down by the store, improving pedestrian crossings for site access, and implementing new rotating exhibits, which is kind of something we'll see further along in our special projects. And I think the kind of the grand end would be a long-term partnership with the university system like Nichols State, just a few miles down the road, that would provide kind of the staffing, funding, and learning to make this a similar to the Rural Life Museum in Baton Rouge, but a living environment in which people can work, go to field school, and undergo preservation, archaeology, teaching while still helping at the site. Next slide, please.
Okay, so starting off our special projects, the first one that we really took a deep dive into was the gardens back in the Laurel Valley Village. So next slide. So Sarah and I worked on just doing a lot of research in terms of what the gardens could have looked like in this area. There's a lot of evidence that shows that there were fences that would separate entrances in multiple garden areas. And it appears that a lot of the gardens were in between the houses, and that a lot of the people who potentially lived in these houses had their own specific gardens to be able to grow vegetation, food, stuff for nutritional purposes and for medicinal purposes. So going into that, that's something that we really spent a lot of time researching. Next slide. So here you can see the evidence for the all of the fences that we found and what they would have potentially looked like. Next slide. So once again, looking into kind of the research that we did on this project, we worked with a master gardener from New Orleans named Tammany Baumgarten to help identify a lot of the vegetation that we saw on site when we visited, most of them being interesting ones like Latin American fleabane, cleavers, just very different types of vegetation that could be used for a multitude of purposes that really give us a look into the life of the people who live there. Next slide. So here you can see a map of just the locations of where we found some of these different types of plants. And here you can see the ones that we found that had medicinal purposes, nutritional purposes, or both, and where they were located on the site. And we were very interested in looking at how they were possibly grouped in different areas. Next slide, yeah. So these are just some of the examples of some of the different types of plants that we found that were used for medicinal purposes, a lot of them being used to help with different problems, whether it's just common cold illnesses, different type of illnesses that you would find. And they all had a lot of different value that we thought was interesting. Next slide. Some nutritional ones, lettuce, tree onion, chives, mint. These are just some of the different types of plants that we were able to find and identify. Next slide. And we thought it would be interesting going forward with this special project to maybe use the research and the information that we found to implement more programming into just what they already have there now, possibly looking into, this is just a reference to a man named Michael Twitty who does a whole cooking group called Southern Discomfort Tour, where he goes and he speaks about different types of cooking and things you would find in an enslaved type history, and just looking at that. And yeah, we just thought it was really interesting and something that could be implemented at Laurel Valley. Next slide.
Okay, so another special project was a slavery database. A slavery database will be paramount in telling an inclusive narrative of plantation life and be essential in diversifying the current tourism population. We must celebrate and highlight the enslaved Africans who occupied the slave cabins on this site. We will be remiss to talk about the architectural significance of the site without mentioning the hands who built these structures. Next slide, please. The Slave Origin website is a collaborative digital initiative that compiles and makes publicly accessible records of the largest slave trade in history. The site reveals about 12 million Africans were sent here to the Atlantic via slave trade ships, and hundreds of thousands more were trafficked within the Americas. Next slide, please. This is just a quick map to view. It accuses the number of slaves who would disembark in the New World after captivity. Next slide, please. And this data also reveals the year slaves arrived in Louisiana and what region and the number of slaves that arrived. Next slide, please. So on a site visit to Nichols archival building, it was 3 enslaved names that was included in the court case, J.W. Tucker versus United States. These ex-slaves testified on record on their accounts of the events that took place when the Northern troops invaded the plantation after the Civil War. The slaves took their masters' names after being sold, so it's difficult to locate information and histories on the enslaved. Next slide, please. When more information can be found about the enslaved people, this information can be located on the Laurel Valley Plantation's website, similar to the enslaved database at the Evergreen Plantation. It can also be used as highlighted as the Whitney Plantation has done here at the Wall of Honor to understand and to highlight and celebrate the enslaved Africans who occupied the plantation and also built many other structures there. Next slide, please. Thank you.
Okay, and keeping with what Monica just displayed there, we found it important to do memorialization at Laurel Valley Plantation. It's not only necessary to tell the histories of the underrepresented, but also memorialize the enslaved. So in the next slide here, here's a graph, and you could just see the enslaved population at Laurel Valley Plantation in 1853 or 1852 alone. There were 130 recorded enslaved people living at the plantation. So the next slide is the proposed site for memorialization at the school/church. This is the bottom right photo shows a photo by Philip M. Denham. And in that you can see a cross at the on the building. It's because it's a site of not only education, but also of worship that we found that this would be a great site for memorialization altogether. Next slide. And also it's important to utilize LIDAR and in conjunction with archaeology, because this can really give us more information to try to locate the site of the burials of the enslaved and give more available data sets to investigate. So here, ground LIDAR is the best thing to use. You can get a really detailed account of that. And then in the next slides, you're going to be talked to about how this process can work. Well, I can speak to the, this isn't my slide, but memorialization of the enslaved. So this emergence of the new social history. And here again, as shown with Monica's previous slide, is Whitney Plantation, where they've done an excellent job of the memorialization. Next slide.
So this is just an idea that we had, taking the topics from Monica and also the idea of memorializing these people here who lived on this village and on this site, but also combining it with the research that we did with the gardens and taking that into account by maybe creating these memorial gardens that could be very beautiful, but also a place just to memorialize the history of the site that we've studied. So these are just two really very cool projects that we looked into: the UVA Enslaved People's Memorial Garden, and then also the one at UGA at the University of Georgia, where they also did a type of enslaved people's memorial garden, which we thought would be very cool to implement at Laurel Valley. So next slide.
And then our final of the special projects is talking about the interpretation of the sugar mill and a little bit about labor on a Louisiana plantation. Next slide, please. So as previously noted by Noah, the mill was an important part of the plantation network, and in having a structure like this still extant in some way, we think it'd be important to interpret this both as like a aspect to bring people to the site, as well as just something that is significant in understanding how a plantation worked in the early 20th and late 19th centuries. Next slide. So looking at some interpretation precedent projects, we looked at the President's House in Philadelphia, which is part of the National Independence Mall area. And what it does is it reconstructs what was the former, or portions of the former building there. But what I think is significant in understanding it as a precedent project is how it utilizes what were those former walls and some of the ruins as interpretation space, both for display and for creating circulation through the site. And then on the bottom of the slide, you can see Mill Ruins Park in downtown Minneapolis, which creates new walkways that are located elevated from the historic ruins on the site. And then it has interpretive signage throughout that allows both people to freely roam through the site while also creating a curated path. Next slide. So this is what the mill looked like in its original form. Next slide. That's the first floor plan. Most of what's extant now is only on that first level. Next slide. This is the ruins as they were in the 1970s from the hair drawings, and overlaid with some of the 3D of the mill. And next slide, please. This is my proposal, or our proposal, for some kind of circulation through these former through these ruins. Important in circulating through this is creating areas that are allowing people to gather for teaching within the space, and then also creating circulation that covers each of the important elements that are still extant there. Next slide. So as you're circulating through this proposed interpretation of the ruins, you're able to get elements that of the different processes that took place within the mill, and then it's creating circulation from like through this mill into the surrounding labor complex where people lived. So trying to tell these stories together is an important part in interpreting the mill and the plantation itself. Next slide. And these are just some general design recommendations on what these paths through the interpretative mill could look like. Next slide. So really, we have a large comprehensive list of projects that have potential both in small term or short term and long term goals for the plantation. They range from creating university partnerships, allowing students to work on some of these sites to get more cost-effective labor in preserving the site, creating new elements, doing different history databases and whatnot. So yeah, thank you guys very much.
Well done.
Wow, thanks for last. That was outstanding. My God. I know Marion Feinberg. Her and I touched base last year about Laurel Valley, and it brings my heart so much joy that a study of this capacity was brought. Did she approach you guys, or did you approach her? Or the family, not just Marion, but
I'll answer that. Originally, the Laurel Valley site was intended to be included in the Studio 1, which is a slightly different focus than the Studio 2 urban conservation that we're talking about now. But because of Hurricane Ida, really kind of ruining the entire structure of the fall of 2021 semester, we didn't want the students to lose the opportunity to get to work with this site. So Brent Fortenberry, the director, who's the instructor for Studio 1, mentioned that we could incorporate it into our syllabus for this semester. And John, having some great contacts back from the 70s, which I think were referenced in the students' presentation, and generated this comprehensive and really, just like benchmark report on the conditions and the history of the plantation. It felt like a really perfect fit, to get to revisit it. And I think the students did a great job of showing how, when you have, the different research and documentation and investigations periodically, you can really use them to help generate very specific information that's very tailored to identifying critical path elements, as well as, bringing into the conversation, the current dialogues that we're having today.
Knowing how Studio 1 and Studio 2 work, I think that this was it worked out perfectly for Studio 2, for it to occur in this one. Yeah. And I'm very interested to hear what you have to say about this, like from a federal perspective. I think there's so much opportunity that can come from that.
I have a lot, and I'm sorry that there's not more time, because there's so much more I want to hear from the students. This was very impressive. I see now where the documentation part of things came in the course, for sure. Super impressed with the documentation that you guys did, and like Tony said, the importance of having that in place. You kind of got to see it in real time with Hurricane Ida. I think it's amazing that you've got the man who did it in the 1970s right there advising you and leading the way. That is fantastic. I was going to mention that being able to speak to the people who have been working on these structures. I know Dr. Paul Leslie, I think you guys spoke to him out there, and he had a big part in this, and that is so important. Yeah, there's a lot here. So I have a couple of questions, and I have a couple of things that I wanted to point out. Monica, first, Annaberg in Virgin Islands. I lived and worked in Virgin Islands National Park for 5 years. Annaberg is where my heart is. It's a tough place. Funding wise, it's a lot of work, and so I that's where I kind of go with this being privately owned, and the uphill climb that the property owners have with these structures. So kind of starting out with that, this baseline documentation is a form of preservation, right? I mean, having that in place first. I like seeing the different phases that you guys have. The thing that I really wanted to focus on is this idea that you've got kind of this huge opportunity to, with the slavery database, with the research that you've done, Monica. I was very impressed. I'm glad we get to kind of go back to revisit this from the first presentation. I'm so curious about that research that you've been doing regarding the enslaved people who are living and working in these places. And I think the opportunity at Laurel Valley is to incorporate that from the get-go, as opposed to having a well-established interpretive site where enslaved people's stories are kind of an afterthought. Have you ever been to a place where it's kind of just posted up in the middle of an exhibit, and it is absolutely, was added quickly and randomly instead of being incorporated from the get-go? This is such a major opportunity at Laurel Valley for that. So I would love to see more of that. And I know it's very, very difficult research. It's very challenging. But that is fascinating to me. The other part is the archaeology, and making sure that the archaeology is incorporated in that research. It's so important to have the archives, the on-site assessments and original fabric material assessments, and then married with the archaeology. I did go out to Laurel Valley, and there's obviously some disturbance, but there's so many spots where there's archaeology right on the surface. Even if you did a pedestrian survey, you would get so much information out of that. So I think that's a really, really good point. The LiDAR, SciArc, I'm sure you guys are familiar with SciArc. That's one of the companies that they came out and did Annaberg in 2015, I think, and it's invaluable. That information is we go to it again and again and again. So very, very good recommendations, I think. I wanted to ask about the circulation and the siting. That was something I think, was it Eric, who, I love that photo of the structures and the sugarcane fields, and that made me think about the circulation of the entire complex and the way people were living. That's a tangible reminder there, right, of where people were working and which direction they went in to get to work, how they were moving in between houses. So I was curious about that design concept, the redesign of the circulation, especially kind of around the ruins, and keeping in mind the integrity of, I don't know what the integrity of the circulation is right now. Is it there? Is it something that you guys looked at to keep intact, to keep that integrity intact, the original siting of the buildings, but the circulation between the pathways? That was a lot.
Yeah, we had decided at the beginning of class the existing pathways kind of disrupt the original flow a lot, and there were thoughts about recirculation through that, but Ryan did a lot of great work on following that circulation through the mill. We were very limited on where we could go within that, though, because a lot of it is unsafe at the moment.
So that's the other part of this is, the fact that it's a ruin is its significance, right? It's showing the decline of the production on site. And I'm sorry if I missed this, I apologize. Is the recommendation to preserve it as is right now, kind of cap it and stabilize it and allow people to come through that? Or, I mean, I think it's so rare in the United States to have a ruin that hasn't been either demolished or turned into condos, or it's significant in the fact that it's in ruins and showing the decline of that industry and production there. So
yeah, I think you're speaking to our exact thoughts there. We want to leave it as it is, as to both speak to its history, like the loss of the building and its current state, as well as like keeping it as a significant aspect of the overall plantation and understanding the history of how it worked. So we don't want to remove that from the site. We want to keep it with its context being directly adjacent to the workers' houses and everything. So it's an important part of the overall story of labor on the site.
one thing I would say, I don't know if I noticed this in there, but the kind of that cyclic maintenance plan of 100% recommend that vegetation removal first and foremost. Get that vegetation off of those buildings for sure.
All good stuff. And just reminding us that there are books written about each one of these projects. And here we have less than an hour for each one, but everybody's doing a good job of presenting all our research and ideas for the future of these places, and the responses are terrific. We need to find a way to present this more fully to the stakeholders in particular, who, by the way, in the case of Laurel Valley, are totally excited about what the effort we went to help them out, to see me return after 50 years, like Rip Van Winkle or something, and to really talk about implementing some of this work. I'd like to think that all the people we've worked with on these projects might hire some of us, you students, to help out with internships and beyond. That's how careers get started and connected through programs like this. I'm afraid we've got to stop with this particular project, hard as it is, and it gives space to the final project of the morning, which is Project 3, Flood Adaptation of Historic Buildings on an Urban Scale, Mandeville, Louisiana.
Before I start the slide share, I'd like to say two things. The first one is the slides for the files for these were huge because of the amount of graphics involved. So I have it split into two. It's the water group and Mary, and then I'll have to switch to the second file for Clara. So just so you know that there's a little break there. And secondly, I feel that even with the students understanding the need to speed it up and maybe add some extra abbreviations in there for the finals, we are going to go over time. If any of our jurors, our guests today, are not able to stay past noon, we absolutely understand that, and please don't worry about it. But I think that in the interest of being able to continue having a record for the full presentations, we will complete all of them. So with that, I will start. Thanks.
All right. Hi, everyone. So we'll be talking about preservation planning for urban landscapes, specifically living with water in Mandeville, Louisiana. Next, please. This is a brief overview of Mandeville's history, starting with pre-colonization. To summarize, after colonization and by the late 1800s, the lumber industry in Mandeville and the new railroad line really bolstered Mandeville as a town. At the same time, the town was dealing with consequences of flood events and storms. So early seawalls were constructed in 1913, and a more robust system was constructed in the 1930s as the main defense. Next slide, please. In 1959, both spans of the Causeway Bridge were completed and connected Mandeville to the city of New Orleans more efficiently than before. By the 1970s, seawall renovations took place, and that continued in the 1990s. Meanwhile, Mandeville still saw record storms, and after 2005, new and substantially renovated homes were required to be elevated up to 12 feet above grade after Hurricane Katrina. Next. By 2013, the Mandeville Historic Preservation District was created, and the district was surveyed in 2015. Since then, there have continued to be major flood events, which includes the most recent storm, Hurricane Ida. Next, please.
So just to orient you where Mandeville is, it's on the North Shore, and we just want to make the relationship between Mandeville and New Orleans. So they differ in size and population greatly. So cities such as New Orleans will have the infrastructure to protect them against flooding events with levees and pumps, while cities and towns such as Mandeville and that size do not have these resources, making them more vulnerable to flood events and hurricanes. Next slide. These infographics show how the weather, storm surge, and flooding events will intensify, and consequently, the cost of insurance and other expenses are going to increase as well. Next slide. Mandeville's average rainfall is double the amount of the US average rainfall and is in par with large cities that are dealing with flooding and trying to figure out different solutions to managing their own flooding. Next. These images just show how intense the flooding events and weather events are and how they need to be addressed. Next. This diagram illustrates the height of the flooding during several hurricanes. You can see that they go over the height of the seawall dramatically. So as a result, the seawall will need to be raised significantly to make any sort of difference in stopping the floodwater and storm surge. Next slide. So while the main scope of the studio for Project 3 was elevating historic homes, and we think that this is necessary in order to save the buildings, we want to consider other solutions. So we're looking at Mandeville at a macro level to figure out possible solutions to managing the flooding and manage the flooding there. Next. This is a site plan of Mandeville. So we're going to be covering from the Causeway all the way to Fontainebleau State Park. Next. We're implementing a 3-phase plan to mitigate the flooding. The first phase involves redesigning the streetscape to capture and move rainwater. The second phase involves implementing a secondary barrier of clams out in the water and replanting cypress trees and other native plants along the coastline. And the third and final phase is raising the seawall. Next. For the first phase, we're looking at 3 blocks up Lamarck Street as a case study for phase 1. Next. So on the left, you'll see a drawing that shows the existing conditions. And on the far right, you'll see a drawing that shows our intervention in the block by adding retention ponds in the middle of the blocks to hold and capture rainwater, and then pumps that are designed to look like regular homes are added in vacant lots to help push the water out. Next. Essentially, these diagrams, the one on the left and then the top middle, simplify the drawing seen before. Water will move from the streetscape into the retention ponds and then will be held until the rain event is over. Some water will be absorbed into the ground while the rest can gravitate back into the storm drains. The retention ponds will be a private public amenity for the homeowners. They'll provide both environmental and social benefits, as well as increasing property values and offering tax deductions in response and improve public health. Next.
So we'll be looking a little closer at these interventions first in section to understand their relationship to one another. So this is the first block intervention, and it's kind of important to note just the amount of space between each building at the center of the block. Next, please. And so this is the second block intervention and then the beginning of the third. And in this drawing, you can really see, again, there's a lot of space in the center of the block. In addition, it's kind of interesting to see the difference in scale between the raised buildings and the buildings that have yet to be raised. Next slide, please. And then here you can see the relationship of the third block to Lake Pontchartrain. Next. So this is an enlarged view of the first block where you can see we're kind of taking this case study and trying to look at each block and see the just like what design elements they bring. And in doing this, we're kind of explaining that each block is going to need to be treated individually and differently and in relationship to neighboring blocks. So in this one, we can see how the pumping state, there's space for the pumping station and how the water can be moved from that retention pond out through the streetscape. Next, please. And here's what that looks like in section. We're hoping to make these amenities for neighbors. So it's really like an ideal location to be maintaining. Next, please. This is the second intervention, the block that has the most amount of space and can really offer like a really big opportunity. And again, there's more lots for a pumping station. And then on the next slide, you can see that in section and how there are bridges that can go over these retention ponds. And when there's not water, kind of like water gardens. Next slide, please. And then the third block, there's less space, but this was an interesting intervention to look at because even though there isn't as much open space, there's still a good amount of space to use for retention ponds. Next. And here's what that looks like in section. So while it's still like a little vignette, this little space can actually offer a lot of opportunity. Next, please. So then we also looked at redesigning the streetscape. So first we proposed implementing canals along sidewalks to act as water storage and movement, and that would have vegetation in them as well. And then also regrading the neutral ground so that the slope can allow for water storage and movement in a rain event. Next, please.
So on the left, you'll see a list of native plants that can be planted in the retention ponds that will help with absorbing water while also beautifying the retention ponds. The retention pond actually isn't that deep, and so it's graded, and each one of these plants can be planted in certain zones. Next. And finally, this is a visual how one of the retention ponds, this is actually block 3, will look and feel, as you can see with the plantings and seating and everything along, as well as the trees and how it is in relationship to the buildings or surrounding buildings. Next.
Now moving on to the implementation side of things, something really important for our group was to find a way for all of our recommendations to fit within the existing political and social realities of Mandeville and St. Tammany Parish as a whole. In this section, I'm going to quickly outline the already proposed plans and projects the parish and city has that are compatible with our phase preservation planning proposals for living with the water. And before moving into specifics on conservation easements, which form the backbone of our block interventions. Next slide, please. New Directions 2040 is St. Tammany's proposed local comprehensive plan, and hopefully it's moved beyond the proposed state and become official soon. We found many inspirations and intersections with the parish's plan and our own, especially with the goals and strategies of the Living with Nature section outlined in front of you. In a very condensed format, these are a revised flood protection and drainage system, the conservation of wetland and native plants, and the maintenance and protection of watersheds and groundwater. We believe these goals fit well within our phase proposals. Next slide, please. Here's some more content from another document from the parish, the coastal protection gap analysis. I just wanted to incorporate some concrete figures for the later phases in our proposals, things like the seawall improvements, the living shoreline, and you can see some numbers associated with them put together by the parish and the city. Next slide, please. Now moving towards the conservation easement side of things, I just wanted to quickly highlight the existing water and wetland features present in Old Mandeville. Next slide. As stated throughout, water intrusion in Mandeville is a collective action problem, but the size of the blocks, as outlined earlier by Ellen and Mary Helen, give hope for a solution. We're proposing that landowners yield a portion of their property around the border and interior to a conservation easement. We try to limit this to around 20 to 25% per property and owner in our sample blocks, but we believe the owners will be receptive to this because the scale of the easements is related to the value and size of the property contributed. Land Trust for Louisiana is a nonprofit we identified a good fit for Mandeville's conservation easements as a holder. They specialize in urban green space conservation and inland wetlands specifically. In such arrangements, landowners sign an easement agreement with an entity, government or nonprofit in this case, that allows continued ownership but limits further development. They can still use it in all other ways, but like in this example, interior spaces will be limited for the proposals we covered earlier. The benefit for landowners is, of course, the 2015 federal tax incentive. And if the landowner places a conservation easement on his or her land and limits the future development, the value of the land is reduced. An appraiser will determine this difference in value. And under the 2015 law, the landowner can deduct the value of that easement donation over a 16-year period on his or her federal income taxes. Next slide. One back. Sorry, I was just going to say thank you to everyone that helped us and our professors, and that's it.
All right, so hello, I'm Mary Afseth, and I'll be presenting a proposal for the underutilized space located behind Pat's Rest a While. Next slide. So here's a site plan of the block Pat's is located on. Once an orphanage, this collection of structures was developed and historically preserved by the McGuires in a waterfront into a waterfront complex, restaurant complex, which is highlighted in orange here. Behind the complex, highlighted in orange, is an empty, or the first one's highlighted in blue. Behind the complex, highlighted in orange, is an empty space located on Pat's Rest a While's lot, being currently used as an unpaved grass lot for overflow parking. In between the two selections is a nice gravel lot that provides the total required parking for the Rest a While. Next slide. So today I'll be proposing that the empty space be transformed into an elevated boardwalk that curates space for small businesses to rent out. This is an idea that Barrett McGuire has had for a bit of time due to the fact that the Rest a While brings in hundreds of people every weekend, and the structure could create a dynamic block that can be seen as an all-day experience for those visiting. I had the pleasure of speaking to him, and he proposed a U-shape for the boardwalk that would allow for circulation and act as a gateway for the Rest a While from Claiborne Avenue, seen in this concept diagram. Small businesses that cannot afford to rent out large spaces located in Mandeville would now have an opportunity to rent 400 to 500 square foot space that's located next to a business, bringing in many customers. Next slide. Since this is such a unique project, I couldn't find an entirely similar precedent, so I've pulled from a few. Seaside Florida's walkable, cohesive outdoor market has open air structures that I think could be explored. The downtown waterfront of Beaufort, North Carolina uses an array of different facades along the boardwalk that could be directly applied to this project to create a visually dynamic space. The third is this boardwalk in Florida, which features cohesive facades that show how raising the structure can create an interactive experience with what's happening below, which is in this case the water. And then lastly, Chelsea Market in New York curates a dynamic shopping experience utilizing the walking space in between the shops, which are the tables and little shopping experiences seen here, which can be applied to this project. Next slide. So this U-shape would provide a gateway to Pat's Rest a While and allow for an interesting green space in between the boardwalks. Private spaces, including circulation, storage, and parking, could be located on the outer, darker bays, and the more public spaces, including socialization spaces, additional vendors, and seating could be located towards the center and within the atrium. On the right is the site with my proposal for a service road along the east side of the lot that would allow for parking underneath the entire side of the proposed structure, which accounts for roughly 20 spots. Next slide. Here's an elevation that begins to show my thought process for what this boardwalk could look like from Claiborne Street. Matching a similar style and color palette to the Rest a While will create a cohesive set of structures without attempting to replicate their historic integrity. Here are a few of the materials used on the restaurant complex that would help achieve this aesthetic. Next slide. And then here's a quick section that shows an idea Barrett McGuire had for the center area, which is a music venue space for local artists to come to perform. This would create a dynamic space, especially while walking along the upper boardwalk. Next slide. Here I've made a quick few plan proposals, the first of which being a modular symmetrical proposal with every building facing the center with the possibility of front porch space. Next slide. And the second is a bit more asymmetrical, with the idea being the structures could be different sizes and potentially face different ways to create pockets of interest. Next slide. And lastly, the third plan takes the second a bit further by tailoring the boardwalk around the shape of the buildings with the potential of additional pockets of interest created and creating which would then create an opportunity for tiered levels.
Awesome. Oh, wait. Yeah. Wow, great. You know, the Woodlands has kind of like an interior water feature in Houston, kind of similar. And they use the straight pathway with like pedestrian bridges along the way. Obviously, this would be like a scaled down version of the Woodlands, of course. But I really enjoyed my time in the Woodlands in that space. It was highly wonderful. John, oh wait, I'm so sorry. Are y'all done?
I'm sorry, I just had to switch because the files were so big, but I appreciate the commentary while I was trying to get my computer to do what I needed it to. No, thank you so much, Kelly. Sorry about that. Okay, my laptop can't handle files as large as this entire project together.
So should I present mine now?
Yes, please.
Yes, thanks, Clara.
Okay.
I'm afraid you all, the remaining presentation, speed it up a little bit, please. We're running out of time.
Okay, so hi everyone, my name is Clara Gardner. This project will propose a series of approaches for the rehabilitation of Dawns on the Lake. Next slide. Dawns is located in Mandeville, which can be seen in red. The building specifically located at 1951 Lakeshore Drive, indicated by the yellow marker. Next slide. For these rehabilitation efforts, it's important to understand the site on which the property exists. Dawns is located within the B3 City Zoning District, which is a mixed-use area. Importantly, the site is located within the VE flood zone that has 1% annual chance of flood hazard. In this flood zone, the base elevation is 12 feet, while the property itself rests on a site whose ground elevation is 4 feet. Over the past few years, several hurricanes have caused major damages to this property. Pictured here are the photos from Hurricane Barry in 2019 and most recently Hurricane Ida in 2021. Next. As Dawn currently stands, it is one of the only existing masonry buildings from the antebellum period. It was constructed in 1850 as a tavern. However, during the 1860s, it became part of a larger complex known as the Soldiers' Home, where it served as a hospital for Confederate soldiers. The hospital lost funding in 1880 and the lot remained vacant through 1904. Since then, it has been a grocery store and most notably a bar. The historic image of Dawns from the 1950s is one of the only historic images that currently exists. From this image, the historic front and side elevations were extrapolated. Next slide. Historically, the front facade featured a gallery with 4 doors on both the ground floor and second floor. The building also featured a hipped roof. Since the 1950s, Dawns has lost the hipped roof and gallery. Moreover, the ground floor fenestrations have been radically altered. Next. The rehabilitations of Dawns are proposed in the order of the increasing severity of the intervention and thus the ascending order of complexity and cost. Each of these proposals suggests the abandonment of the ground floor. This is possible because in accordance with the zoning guidelines, the second floor must be at minimum 10 feet above ground elevation. It is actually 11 feet, 3.5 inches. Marked in red are the ground elevation, height of the second floor, the current roof line, and the 1950s roof line. Next. Proposal A is the most conservative rehabilitation effort. It references the historic 1950s building. It adds the front gallery and hip roof back onto the building and reestablishes the historic facade openings while the ground floor accommodates flooding. Next. The side elevation shows the addition of the historic gallery, which seeks to reestablish a visual connection to the lake that was cut off due to the abandonment of the ground floor. Next. Proposal B is a more moderate rehabilitation effort. Includes the construction of a rooftop pergola, which is a reversible addition. The pergola is set one bay back from the major facade following the National Park Service guidelines. The sloping sides created by the sail shades represent the slope of the historic hipped roof. Furthermore, while the ground floor is abandoned, the space is open for removable seating. The entrance to the ground floor area reference those that currently exist. Wrought iron fencing enclose the area, and the horizontal bar alludes to the current sail height. Both the addition of the iron fencing and the installment of the awnings reference those at McLean's Pizzeria, located behind Don's. Next. The open air rooftop bar would be a great addition to the neighborhood. With spectacular views of the lake, especially at sunset, it would attract many visitors to the establishment and reinforce the building's connection with the lake and neighborhood. Next slide. The third and final proposal is the most complex rehabilitation option, for it proposes the construction of a built third floor and the reintroduction of the historic front gallery. The ground floor openings, like Proposal A, reference those of the historic 1950s building. However, the second floor merges the historic with the modern. The two end doors reference the historic doorways, while the two central windows reference those belonging to the current building. Next slide. The addition of the built third floor is an interpretation of the historic hipped roof. As seen in the side elevation, the built part is set one bay back from the front facade, creating an outdoor terrace that references the NPS guidelines. Yet the illusion of the historic hipped roof is preserved through the placement of sail shades similar to those proposed in option B. Thank you so much for listening to the proposal of Don's on the Lake.
Okay, so hello, I'm Samantha Stavis, and my partner Olivia Kendrick and I are going to look at slab on grade flood adaptation. Next, please. So first, we wanted to go into what a slab on grade building is. We have a diagram of the concrete slab that is on grade. Sorry, let me say it like that. Go up next, please. So this is a location in historic Mandeville where all these slab on grades are. Next, please. And then overlaid with the flood zones. So most of them are in the AE zones and and none are in the velocity zone, some are outside. Next, please. We then broke down these slab on grade buildings into 4 stylistic categories: ranch house, minimal traditional cottage, freestanding commercial, and then other. Next, please. And this is a percentage breakdown of the 70 buildings that we found. Next, please. And then we went into characteristics because it's important for our guide on how to elevate these buildings. So this is the ranch house. Most of them are low to the ground. Next, please. And also they're buildings of economy, so very minimal, all of them in a way. Next, please. And then our freestanding commercial is a typology we kind of created to explain these CMU constructed buildings that are typically brick veneered and just very straightforward commercial, kind of what you see in strip malls or house adaptations. Next, please. And this is an example of our others category. So it includes bungalows, shotguns, and split levels, and other buildings not in those 3 categories. Next, please.
Okay, so for our 3 case studies, our design decisions were influenced by the National Park Service and the City of Mandeville's design guidelines. So all of our case study structures were brick. So the elevated portion would be finished with stucco or another smooth material. So you have separation between the new and the old construction. And then an important visual aspect of slab on grade buildings is their connection to the ground. And so we maintained that connection as well as the solid and the void relationships by making sure that the bases had a very solid appearance. So with the ranch house, it is important to maintain the horizontality, which is a character defining feature of the style. And this was accomplished with the horizontal railings and the infill between the piers. All right, next slide. And then with the cottage, the asymmetrical organization of the building was kept along with a minimal level of detailing. Next. So for the commercial building, maintaining symmetry was important. So we made sure that the building was code compliant. And then a primary design factor was making sure that the stairs looked like an addition and not historic fabric, while also maintaining the symmetrical facade of the building. So next slide. So our case studies were just a small sampling of slab on grade buildings. So we added this page of guidelines and considerations we followed. for our designs, and these should be applied to all elevated slab on grade buildings. And that's all for us.
All right. Hello. My name is Anthony Mendez, and my project is 1923 Claiborne Street. Residence is a 1,200 square foot Creole cottage is contributing to Mandeville's historic status. Next slide, please. So I've provided 4 significant maps showing the context of my location respective to Mandeville. In the geographical map, it indicates the property is in Fill Sub Area A. In the more zoomed in zoning map, we see that the property is just outside on that cusp of being residential. The map of the terrain demonstrates how close the property is to Lake Pontchartrain, and the dashed lines represent the coastal transect lines, which for this property, it's in between 26 and 27. The Google map shows the property's relative proximity to Mandeville's other amenities. Next slide, please. Then I performed a conditions assessment on the property and noticed significant discoloration on the exterior wood framing on the veranda, and that's due to wood rot. The prominent turquoise painted wood that was the decking that was in significant disrepair with cracking and paint peeling off. I also wanted to know the design element that was very advantageous was that concrete block of stairs with just one modular that could easily be removed from my design proposal. Next slide. The most pertinent map, which I wanted to highlight, was the LSU flood map viewer, which tells us that the home is in AE11 flood zone and that the ground elevation is 5 feet. That results in a 6-foot difference, 11 minus 5, for the elevation. You also have to account for the 2 feet of freeboard per Mandeville's design guidelines, and that amounts to a total of 8 feet for this project of elevating it. Unfortunately, dry flood proofing and backflow prevention were not really practical for this design project. Next slide. So for this property set on piers, the process for raising that building begins with the disconnection of the property's utilities and placing steel structural beams in between the existing piers and literally just raising the building up. Unified footings are placed 36 inches from the ground, and then we have 4 number 5 rebars, which are tied together to make this sort of rebar cage contraption, and that's placed inside the a 16-inch square CMU block. And then you have the, once you have this CMU block constructed entirely on this one column, you have a Simpson tie, which is strapping the column down for the most ideal connection. You see that in the far right slide here. So next slide, please. Here we see a finished example with that final step of applying the masonry veneer. And I actually noticed this during my site visit on the neighboring house, 1929 Claiborne Street, and it's was undergoing this exact same process. Next slide, please. So my design proposals, in addition to raising the building 8 feet, I've proposed to remove the stairs and rotate them 90 degrees. So you can compare the existing and proposed stairs from my existing elevation and the site plans. Third was to extend the driveway laterally to make way for the extended stair space. Fourth was to replace the wood decking and keep the turquoise paint color with this sort of new decking. And finally was to apply high performance wood hardener for the wooden union jacks you see surrounding the veranda. Next slide, please. And then these are my proposal options for this project, which in one iteration maintains the location of those piers. And my justification for that first option was to maintain the location of the piers and continue with that sort of tapered look. In the second option, just below that, we see the new columns are aligned with the veranda columns per Mandeville's design guidelines. And we see that they aren't necessarily like tapered to the fascia board. For both of my options, one can notice the new Union Jack paneling surrounding the U-shaped staircase, an Acadia velour brick veneer, which was used to be the masonry, which was kind of like the closest beige white surface that I could find. And I also have a 48-inch by 8 feet cedar redwood plastic traditional lattice that is to be installed between the second tapered row of columns, or the straight columns, in both options. Next slide, please. And with that, that concludes my portion of the presentation. This elevation and my proposals with that will provide the owners of the building at least 2 more 30-year mortgages in this location amounting to 60 more years. Thank you very much.
Hello again, my name is Eric Spinrad, and I looked at 2021 Claiborne Street in Mandeville. Next slide, please. So 2021 Mandeville, beautiful Queen Anne style of home, has drop siding, gable on hip, metal moderate pitched roof, 6/6 double hung windows, as well as stained glass and a glazed paneled inset door with transom. According to Sally Reeves' surveys, the construction dates around 1896 for Joseph Levy. Next slide, please. It is in the zone AE flood level 10. It's also, which means altogether, looking at where the elevation sits now, it needs to be raised a total of 7 feet. I should also mention the building was recently sold in 2021. Currently under new ownership, but houses Varsity Sports, which is currently leasing the property. Being a commercial property, it is eligible for historic tax credits and offers a lot of options for bringing it into the future. Next slide. So ideas for flood proofing this, ruled out dry proofing. It's not feasible being a wooden structure. Elevation of the ground just proves to be too costly and difficult. So ultimately, elevation of the building. I mainly looked at raised on concrete columns as well as a raised de-chaussée. Next slide, please. Here's recommended interventions, which also includes, alongside of elevating it, putting a slab below so water flows away from the base, finding a architectural style for that bottom ground addition that doesn't detract from the current style, removal of paint and repainting in a period appropriate palette, removing that old rusty roof and applying a standing seam roof, and then lastly, looking at designated parking and circulation. Next slide, please. So a raised de-chaussée is a Creole style of architecture where that ground floor is raised up and comprises the main living space or premier etage. And here's an example I looked at from New Orleans on 1529 Dorgemois. Next slide, please. So here's the existing structure. It's raised 2 feet on piers and only sits 1 block away from Lake Pontchartrain and currently floods on average about twice a year. Next slide, please. So in the first option, I raised this with that raised de-chaussée. It's a chain wall to add extra support to that. Adding historic vents, not only to allow water to pass through, relieving pressure on that wall, but also aerate the ground floor there. You need that guardrail to meet code, and then you can see the standing seam roof. The remaining 3 elevations outside of that facade would be raised on concrete masonry posts and lattice in between those. Next option for option 2 here shows that raised de-chaussée again, but bringing out that wall to have a raised garden wall bed. And this gets rid of the need for that guardrail. And also you could see, as per Tony's recommendation, having those stairs and a defined upper landing, which gives the original elevation of that building to be, to pull the old from the new there. Next slide. Altogether, kind of like what Robert Cangelosi was mentioning, you need to get budget costs up front before doing these projects. Here, I found a total cost of around $135,000. The next slide, I also looked at the site plan. So it is a large lot. It's really important having that space to, one, you could include drainage and retention pond in the back area there, keeping the gravel driveway, but having more defined parking with handicap parking as well, right next to that ADA lift with wraparound stairs that would go into the back deck of that building. And then the last thing I looked at in the following slide was the Mandeville design guidelines for thinking about new paint and paint colors. And they gave a couple really good guidances here. One of them being that typically back in this time period, it was about 3 colors would be applied to the Queen Anne style. And these were usually contrasting in bold color schemes. So in the next slide, you can see trying to re-envision this building altogether with that new palette, getting rid of the historically inappropriate greens and trying to re-envision this all together. So in the last slide here, I just show an example of fusing all these together where you have that raised de Chaussee, you have the new color palette in the standing seam roof. This was a really fun project to try to just think about bringing these buildings into the future and dealing with flood management. And then the last slide, just on behalf of the class and everybody, just saying once again, thanks to everybody who helped us on all 3 of these projects. That includes Ann Masson, Brooke Tessler, Daniel Hammer, James Rolfe, Bill McKee, Paul Leslie, Malcolm Hodnett, Kevin Williams, Clifton Thoreau, John Lafarge, Matt Ory, Mia Kaplan, Roderick Scott, Louisette Scott, Jeff Bernard, Barrett McGuire. Also, thank you to those who joined us today, Kelly Calhoun, Ann Finney, and Dr. Robert Cangelosi, and then our great teachers, Tony DiMaggio and John Stubbs. Thank you.
Perfect ending to the formal presentations. Thank you, students, very much. Any comments from the respondents?
You know, I think everyone you thanked is probably some of the biggest names and, you know, part of a large pot of big names in preservation that we are lucky enough in South Louisiana and this whole region to study among. Every one of those people are always willing to be part of or give advice to anybody in the field at any time, even past graduation. So I'm happy to hear all those names and that you're involved in communication, because it doesn't stop here, it keeps going. You're going to be involved with these people for like the rest of your lives in some capacity, or they'll connect you in different parts of the world to their network. And so thank you guys for such amazing presentations. I'll start off with Mandeville. So part of my experience in preservation and what it's ended up progressing into is not only historic tax credits, National Register nominations, architecture surveys, and district creations, but it's also an element of like property acquisition. And my most recent property acquisition that I'm a part of is in Old Mandeville on Carroll Street, 300 Carroll Street. And a huge component of this residential sale was a little bit of all the topics that you guys have covered throughout studying Mandeville. Obviously, flooding was one of the first things that they talked about, and we had to present some of the evidence, including a lot of the maps that you presented here. Conservation easement, this property has a conservation easement. So I had to explain what that means, why it's there, what the benefits are, and what the restrictions are. So I'm happy to hear that you guys studied that as well. And then preservation planning for historic structures. And then they also have a slab on grade garage with a apartment above. So everything that you studied is part of this property that we're closing on tomorrow, and it's on everybody's mind. So and I think even in the past years, the Preservation Resource Center had a huge article, like a huge feature in their magazine about the raising of Mandeville properties. What's the right thing to do? And it's highly important. Even just walking around now, like what's that big restaurant there? The Conflict Press? The Lake House?
That's restaurant.
The Lake House. They receive constant flooding, so they're having to relocate because of this issue. Is there any plan implemented by Mandeville already to get this going, or is this the idea of two-lane students?
I could answer that quickly. I believe this whole thing started as an invitation from Roderick McIntosh, who's a national leader in flood protection who lives in Mandeville and is husband to the former city planner, Louisette. So he has been a primary resource here, really an instructor, honorary instructor for this class who's been fabulous. He knows everything and has got a rare knowledge of use of federal funding that could be granted to property owners. So we were really driving away at understanding those facts and figures, and his interest in this is trying to train up another generation of preservationists to understand the complexity of this work and to go out and help the hundreds of thousands of property owners across the whole Gulf Coast and beyond to use these various tools for flood mitigation.
Thank you. All right.
So just kind of piggybacking on that, that was very impressive. And I would say, you know, speaking to the federal funding side of things, you know, make yourself very familiar with the Section 106 process and obviously the Secretary of the Interior's guidelines, which was evident that you guys were looking at and have a solid knowledge of. I want to make sure also, it sounded like Clara, you were possibly looking at the 2019, the flood adaptation guidelines for rehabilitation, which gives so much more flexibility for these kind of adaptations for climate change. And I would say, what, job security? This is it. This is, and the rest of coastal Southeast United States is looking to Louisiana on how to handle these things. And so being very, very familiar with the latitude that you have for rehabilitating these structures within those guidelines, especially if there is federal funding involved, that's going to be really important, that compliance process. That I love the way you guys gave good solutions and good applications that are doable for property owners, and those different options and alternatives. Those were really clear and fantastic to see the different options and cost estimates. So homeowners or business owners have a solid grasp of what they're dealing with and what they're able to do. That was fantastic. And learn those FEMA flood maps. Keep this. This is the biggest thing that we're dealing with right now in the Park Service. And in fact, yesterday, I don't know if you guys saw some of those videos from Cape Hatteras. So that's.
And you need to give everyone your cell phone number.
Yeah, Tony's got my email address. Please feel free to share that. And yes, absolutely.
And Anne's currently stationed at the Jean Lafitte, I think, building in the French Quarter. So just feel free to drop by anytime.
Well, like everybody else,
anytime you're doing surveying in the quarter.
I mean,
I'm on Bourbon Street. I didn't know you were there. I'll pop over to you sometime.
I'm teleworking, so I'm in and out kind of, but yeah, it's kind of all over the place. So yes.
Yeah, very nice job, everybody. Golly, this is the best one that we've had yet, John.
I think so. Honestly, this class has been the dream class of all. I have to say, you've done better than any I've known in all my long years of teaching. The collegiality, the cooperation, the diligence, the expertise that you've applied to your various projects. I remind everybody, you've seen about 100 of over 600 drawings that were produced by this huge class of 19 students. I've said from the outset, the whole thing is, we're kind of running it as if it was a big architectural office that's specializing in preservation planning. And our theory was really to expose students to what's going on in the real world out there and to join the army of people that are going out into the field to preserve and present the cultural heritage of our country and beyond. So thank you all, students, ever so much. This is really, really a special moment for me, for reasons you know. And thank you to the jury for being with us today. You were all brilliant. For the longer versions of all of these presentations, we can send them to you from the individual project presentations. We have to stop now. Thank you all so ever so much, and best of luck going forward in your educational endeavors and in your careers. And let's work together as a team going out to do what we're training ourselves to do: save the world. Over and out. Thank you all, Tony.
Pleasure.
To add my thanks as well, both to our guests who stayed with us in the morning and for all of the work that you did today, of which was just a really, really small percentage. So thank you for your engagement.
Fantastic.
Thanks,
Well
John.
done, everybody.
All right. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.